Chapter 1 of Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Evan F. Discoveries Amongst the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon by Austen Layard. Chapter 1. The trustees of the British Museum resume excavations at Nineveh. Departure from Constantinople. Description of our party. Roads from Trebizond to Erzurum. Description of the country. Armenian churches. Erzurum. Rashid Pasha. The Dudjuk tribes. Shahan Bey. Turkish reform. Journey through Armenia. An Armenian bishop. The lakes of Shilu and Nazik. After a few months' residence in England during the year 1848, to recruit a constitution worn by long exposure to the extremes of an eastern climate, I received orders to proceed to my post at Her Majesty's Embassy in Turkey. The trustees of the British Museum did not, at that time, contemplate further excavations on the site of ancient Nineveh. Ill health and limited time had prevented me from placing before the public, previous to my return from the East, the results of my first researches, with the illustrations of the mountains and copies of the inscriptions recovered from the ruins of Assyria. They were not published until some time after my departure, and did not consequently receive that careful superintendence and revision necessary to works of this nature. And let me here, at the very outset, gratefully acknowledge that generous spirit of English criticism which overlooks the incapacity and shortcomings of the laborer when his object is worthy of praise. And that object is sought with sincerity and singleness of purpose. The gratitude, which I deeply felt for encouragement rarely equaled, could be best shown by cheerfully consenting, without hesitation, to the requests made to me by the trustees of the British Museum, urged by public opinion, to undertake the superintendence of a second expedition into Assyria. Being asked to furnish a plan of operations, I stated what appeared to me to be the course best calculated to produce interesting and important results, and to enable us to obtain the most accurate information on the ancient history, language, and arts, not only of Assyria, but of its sister kingdom, Babylonia. Perhaps my plan was too vast and general to admit of performance or warrant adoption. I was merely directed to return to the site of Nineveh, and to continue the researches commenced amongst its ruins. Arrangements were hastily, and of course inadequately, made in England. The assistance of a competent artist was most desirable, to portray with fidelity those monuments which injury and decay had rendered unfit for removal. Mr. F. Cooper was selected by the trustees of the British Museum to accompany the expedition in this capacity. Mr. Hormuzd Rassam, already well known to many of my readers for the share he had taken in my first discoveries, quitted England with him. They both joined me at Constantinople. Dr. Sandwith, an English physician on a visit to the East, was induced to form one of our party. One Abd el-Messiah, a Catholic Syrian of Mardin, an active and trustworthy servant during my former residence in Assyria, was fortunately at this time in the capital, and again entered my service. My other attendants were Mohammed Aga, a Kawas, and an Armenian named Circus. The faithful Bayraktar, who had so well served me during my previous journey, had accompanied the English commission for the settlement of the boundaries between Turkey and Persia, with the understanding, however, that he was to meet me at Mosul, in case I should return. Kowal Yusuf, the head of the preachers of the Yazidis, with 4 chiefs of the districts in the neighborhood of Dirak Bir, who had been for some months in Constantinople, completed my party. In consequence of the severe and unjust treatment of the Yazidis, in compelling them to serve in the Turkish army, Hussein Bey and Sheikh Nasser, the chiefs of the whole community, hearing that I was at Constantinople, sent a deputation to the Sultan. Through Sir Stratford Canning's friendly interference, a firman was obtained, and they were freed from all illegal impositions for the future. Our arrangements were complete by the 28th of August, 1849, and on that day we left the Bosphorus by an English steamer bound for Trebizond. The size of my party, and its consequent encumbrances rendering a caravan journey absolutely necessary, I determined to avoid the usual tracks, and to cross eastern Armenia and Kurdistan, both on account of the novelty of part of the country in a geographical point of view, and its political interest as having only recently been brought under the immediate control of the Turkish government. We disembarked at Trebizond on the 31st, and on the following day commenced our land journey. The country between this port and Erzurum has been frequently traversed and described. Through it passed the caravan routes connecting Persia with the Black Sea, the great lines of intercourse and commerce between Europe and Central Asia. The roads usually frequented are 3 in number. The summer, or upper road, is the shortest, but it is the most precipitous, and, crossing very lofty mountains, is closed after the snows commence. It is called Çakılar, from its fine upland pastures on which the horses are usually fed when caravans take this route. The middle route has few advantages over the upper, and is rarely followed by merchants, who prefer the lower, although making a considerable detour by Gümüşhane, or the silver mines. The 3 unite at the town of Bayburt, halfway between the sea and Erzurum. Although an active and daily increasing trade is carried on by these roads, no means whatever have until recently been taken to improve them. They consist of mere mountain tracks, deep in mud or dust according to the season of the year. The bridges have been long permitted to fall into decay, and commerce is frequently stopped for days by the swollen torrent or for this stream. This has been one of the many evil results of the system of centralization so vigorously commenced by Sultan Mahmud, and so steadily carried out during the present reign. Since my visit to Trebizond, a road for carts has been commenced, which is to lead from that port to the Persian frontiers, but it will, probably, like other undertakings of the kind, be abandoned long before completed, or if ever completed, will be permitted at once to fall into ruin from the want of common repair. And yet the Persian trade is one of the chief resources of revenue of the Turkish Empire, and unless conveniences are afforded for its prosecution, will speedily pass into other hands. The southern shores of the Black Sea, 12 years ago rarely visited by a foreign vessel, are now coated by steamers belonging to 3 companies, which touch nearly weekly at the principal ports, and there is commerce and traffic enough for more. The want of proper harbors is a considerable drawback in the navigation of a sea so unstable and dangerous as the Euxine. Trebizond has a mere roadstead, and from its position is otherwise little calculated for a great commercial port, which, like many other places, it has become rather from its hereditary claims as a representative of a city once famous than from any local advantages. The only harbor on the southern coast is that of Batun, nor is there any retreat for vessels on the Circassian shores. This place is therefore probably destined to become the emporium of trade, both from its safe and spacious port, and from the facility it affords of internal communication with Persia, Georgia, and Armenia. At the back of Trebizond, as indeed along the whole of this singularly bold and beautiful coast, the mountains rise in lofty peaks, and are wooded with trees of enormous growth and admirable quality, furnishing an unlimited supply of timber for commerce or war. Innumerable streams force their way to the sea through deep and rocky ravines. The more sheltered spots are occupied by villages and hamlets, chiefly inhabited by a hardy and industrious race of Greeks. In spring the choicest flowers perfume the air, and luxuriant creepers clothe the limbs of gigantic trees. In summer the richest pastures enamel the uplands, and the inhabitants of the coast drive their flocks and herds to the higher regions of the hills. Our journey to Erzurum was performed without incident. A heavy and uninterrupted rain for 2 days tried the patience and temper of those who for the first time encountered the difficulties and incidents of eastern travel. The only place of any interest, passed during our ride, was a small Armenian village, the remains of a larger, with the ruins of 3 early Christian churches, or baptisteries. These remarkable buildings, of which many examples exist, belong to an order of architecture peculiar to the most eastern districts of Asia Minor and to the ruins of ancient Armenian cities, on the borders of Turkey and Persia. There are many interesting questions connected with this Armenian architecture which will deserve elucidation. From it was probably derived much that passed into the Gothic, whilst the Tartar conquerors of Asia Minor adopted it, as will be hereafter seen, for their mausoleums and places of worship. It is peculiarly elegant, both in its decorations, its proportions, and the general arrangement of the masses, and might with advantage be studied by the modern architect. Indeed, Asia Minor contains a mine of similar materials unexplored and almost unknown. We reached Erzurum on the 8th, and were most hospitably received by the British consul, Mr. Brandt, a gentleman who has long, and honorably sustained our influence in this part of Turkey, and who was the first to open an important field for our commerce in Asia Minor. With him I visited the commander-in-chief of the Turkish forces in Anatolia, who had recently returned from a successful expedition against the wild mountain tribes of central Armenia. Rashid Pasha, known as the Guzlu, or the wearer of spectacles, enjoyed the advantages of an European education, and had already distinguished himself in the military career. With the knowledge of the French language, he united a taste for European literature, which, during his numerous expeditions into districts unknown to Western travelers, had led him to examine their geographical features, and to make inquiries into the manners and religion of their inhabitants. His last exploit had been the subjugation of the tribes inhabiting the Dudjuk Mountains, to the southwest of Erzurum, long an open rebellion against the Sultan. The account he gave me of the country and its occupants, though curious and interesting, is not perhaps to be strictly relied on, but a district hitherto inaccessible may possibly contain the remains of ancient races, monuments of antiquity, and natural productions of sufficient importance to merit the attention of the traveler in Asia Minor. The city of Erzurum is rapidly declining in importance, and is almost solely supported by the Persian transit trade. It would be nearly deserted if that traffic were to be thrown into a new channel by the construction of the direct road from Batun to the Persian frontiers. It contains no buildings of any interest, with the exception of a few ruins of monuments of early Muslim domination, and the modern Turkish edifices, dignified with the names of palaces and barracks, are meeting the fate of neglected mud. The districts of Armenia and Kurdistan, through which lay our road from Erzurum to Mosul, are sufficiently unknown and interesting to merit more than a casual mention. Our route by the lake of Van, Bitlis, and Jazira was nearly a direct one. It had been but recently opened to caravans. The haunts of the last of the Kurdish rebels were on the shores of this lake. After the fall of the most powerful of their chiefs, Bedr Khan Bey, they had one by one been subdued and carried away into captivity. Only a few months had, however, elapsed since the Beys of Bitlis, who had longest resisted the Turkish arms, been captured. With them, rebellion was extinguished for the time in Kurdistan. Our caravan consisted of my own party, with the addition of a muleteer and his 2 assistants, natives of Bitlis, who furnished me with 17 horses and mules from Erzurum to Mosul. The first day's ride, as is customary in the East, where friends accompany the traveler far beyond the city gates, and where the preparations for a journey are so numerous that everything cannot well be remembered, scarcely exceeded 9 miles. We rested for the night in the village of Guli, whose owner, one Shahan Bey, had been apprised of my intended visit. He had rendered his newly built house as comfortable as his means would permit for our accommodation, and, after providing us with an excellent supper, passed the evening with me. Descended from an ancient family of Derabeys, he had inherited the hospitality and polished manners of a class now almost extinct, in consequence of the policy pursued by the Turkish sultans, Mahmud and Abdul Majid, to break down the great families and men of middle rank, who were more or less independent, and to consolidate and centralize the vast Ottoman Empire. It is customary to regard these old Turkish lords as inexorable tyrants, robber chiefs, who lived on the plunder of travelers and of their subjects. That there were many who answered to this description cannot be denied, but they were, I believe, exceptions. Amongst them were some rich in virtues and high and noble feeling. It has been frequently my lot to find a representative of this nearly extinct class in some remote and almost unknown spot in Asia Minor, or Albania. I have been received with affectionate warmth at the end of a day's journey by a venerable bey or aga in his spacious mansion, now fast crumbling to ruin, but still bright with the remains of rich, yet tasteful, oriental decoration. His long beard, white as snow, falling low on his breast, his many-folded turban shadowing his benevolent yet manly countenance, and his limbs enveloped in the noble garments rejected by the new generation. His hall open to all comers. The guest neither asked from whence he came or whither he was going, dipping his hands with him in the same dish, his servants standing with reverence before him, rather his children than his servants, his revenues spent by raising fountains on the wayside for the weary traveler, or in building caravansaries on the dreary plain, not only professing, but practicing all the duties and virtues enjoined by the Quran, which are Christian duties and virtues too. In his manners, his appearance, his hospitality, and his faithfulness, a perfect model for a Christian gentleman. The race is fast passing away, and I feel grateful in being able to testify, with a few others, to its existence once, against prejudice, intolerance, and so-called reform. Our host at Guli, Shahan Bey, although not an old man, was a very favorable specimen of the class I have described. He was truly, in the noble and expressive phraseology of the East, an Ojak-zadeh, a child of the hearth, a gentleman born. His family had originally migrated from Dagestan, and his father, a pasha, had distinguished himself in the wars with Russia. He entertained me with animated accounts of feuds between his ancestors and the neighboring chiefs, and steadily refused to allow any recompense to himself or his servants for his hospitality. From Guli we crossed a high range of mountains, running nearly east and west, by a pass called Alibaba, or Alababa, enjoying from the summit an extensive view of the plain of Pasvin, one of the most thickly peopled and best cultivated districts in Armenia. The Christian inhabitants were partly induced by promises of land and protection, and partly compelled by force, to accompany the Russian army into Georgia after the end of the last war with Turkey. By similar means, that part of the Phasalak of Erzurum adjoining the Russian territories was almost stripped of its most industrious Armenian population. To the south of us rose the snow-capped mountains of the Bin Guil, or the Thousand Lakes, in which the Araxes and several confluences of the Euphrates have their source. We descended from the pass into undulating and barren downs. The villages, thinly scattered over the low hills, were deserted by their inhabitants, who, at this season of the year, pitch their tents and seek pasture for their flocks in the uplands. Next day we continued our journey amongst undulating hills, abounding in flocks of the great and lesser bustard. Innumerable sheep walks branched from the beaten path, a sign that villages were near, but, like those we had passed the day before, they had all been deserted for the Ilyaks, or summer pastures. These villages are still such as when they were when Xenophon traversed Armenia. Their houses, says he, were underground, the mouth resembling that of a well, but spacious below. There was an entrance dug for the cattle, but the inhabitants descended by ladders. In these houses were goats, sheep, cows, and foals, with their young. The low hovels, mere holes in the hillside, and the common refuge of man, poultry, and cattle, cannot be seen from any distance, and they are purposely built away from the road to escape the unwelcome visits of traveling government officers and marching troops. It is not uncommon for a traveler to receive the first intimation of his approach to a village by finding his horse's 4 feet down its chimney, and himself taking his place unexpectedly in the family circle through the roof. Numerous small streams wind among the valleys, marking by meandering lines perpetual green their course to the Aras, or Araxes. We crossed that river about midday by a ford not more than 3 feet deep, but the bed of the stream is wide, and after rains, and during the spring, is completely filled by an impassable torrent. During the afternoon we crossed the western spur of the Tikab Mountains, a high and bold range with 3 well-defined peaks, which had been visible from the summit of the Alababa Pass. From the crest we had the first view of Subhan, or Span, Dach, a magnificent conical peak covered with eternal snow, and rising abruptly from the plain to the north of Lake Wan. It is a conspicuous and beautiful object from every part of the surrounding country. We descended into the wide and fertile plain of Hinnis. The town was just visible in the distance, but we left it to the right and halted for the night in the large Armenian village of Kosli, after a ride of more than 9 hours. I was received at the guest house, a house reserved for travelers, and supported by joint contributions, with great hospitality by one Misrab Aga, a Turk, to whom the village formerly belonged as a Sphalic or military tenure, and who, deprived of his hereditary rights, had now farmed its revenues. He hurried with a long stick among the low houses, and heaps of dry dung, piled up in every open space for winter fuel, collecting fowls, curds, bread, and barley, abusing at the same time the tazimat, which compelled such exalted travelers as ourselves, he said, to pay for the provisions we condescended to accept. The inhabitants were not, however, backward in furnishing us with all we wanted, and the flourish of Misrab Aga's stick was only the remains of an old habit. I invited him to supper with me, an invitation he gladly accepted, having himself contributed a tender lamb roasted whole towards our entertainment. The inhabitants of Kosli could scarcely be distinguished either by their dress or by their general appearance from the Kurds. They seemed prosperous and were on the best terms with the Mussulman farmer of their tithes. The village stands at the foot of the hills forming the southern boundary of the plains of Hinis, through which flows a branch of the Murad Su, or lower Euphrates. We forded this river near the ruins of a bridge at Kara Kupri. The plain is generally well cultivated, the principal produce being corn and hemp. The villages, which are thickly scattered over it, have the appearance of extreme wretchedness, and, with their low houses and heaps of dry manure piled upon the roofs and in the open spaces around, look more like gigantic dung hills than human habitations. The Kurds and Armenian Christians, both hardy and industrious races, are pretty equally divided in numbers, and live sociably in the same filth and misery. We left the plains of Hinis by a path through the mountain range of Zernak. On reaching the top of the pass, we had an interrupted view of the Suban Dagh. From the village of Karagol, where we halted for the night, it rose abruptly before us. This magnificent peak, with the rugged mountains of Kurdistan, the river Euphrates winding through the plain, the peasants driving the oxen over the corn on the threshing floor, and the groups of Kurdish horsemen with their long spears and flowing garments, formed one of those scenes of Eastern travel which can leave an indelible impression on the imagination, and bring back in after years indescribable feelings of pleasure and repose. We crossed the principal branch of the Euphrates soon after leaving Karagol. Although the river is fordable at this time of year, during the spring it is nearly a mile in breadth, overflowing its banks, and converting the entire plain into one great marsh. We now had to pick our way through a swamp, scaring, as we advanced, myriads of wild fowl. I have rarely seen game in such abundance and such variety in one spot. The water swarmed with geese, duck, and teal, the marshy ground with herons and snipe, and the stubble with bustards and cranes. After the rains, the lower road is impassable, and caravans are obliged to make a considerable circuit along the foot of the hills. We were not sorry to escape the fever-breeding swamp in the mud of the plain, and to enter a line of low hills, separating us from the lake of Gula Sailu. I stopped for a few minutes at an Armenian monastery, situated on a small platform overlooking the plain. The bishop was at his breakfast, his fare frugal and episcopal enough, consisting of nothing more than boiled beans and sour milk. He insisted that I should partake of his repast, and I did so, in a small room scarcely large enough to admit the round tray containing the dishes, into which I dipped my hand with him and his chaplain. I found him profoundly ignorant, like the rest of his class, grumbling about taxes and abusing the Turkish government. After a pleasant drive of 5 hours, we reached a deep, clear lake, embedded in the mountains. 2 or 3 pelicans, swan and shadow double, and myriads of waterfowl, lazily floating on its blue waters. Piron, the village where we halted for the night, stands at the further end of the Gula Shailu, and is inhabited by Kurds of the tribe of the Hassanalov, and by Armenians, all living in good fellowship amidst the dirt and wretchedness of their eternal dung heaps. Ophthalmia had made sad havoc amongst them, and the doctor was soon surrounded by a crowd of the blind and diseased clamoring for relief. The villagers had said that a Persian, professing to be a hakim, had passed through the place some time before, and had offered to cure all bad eyes on payment of a certain sum in advance. These terms being agreed to, he gave his patients a powder which left the sore eyes as they were and destroyed the good ones. He then went his way, and with the money in his pocket too, added a ferocious-looking Kurd, whose appearance certainly threw considerable doubt on the assertion. But what can one do in these days of the accursed Tanzimat, reform? The lake of Shailu is separated from the larger lake of Nazik by a range of low hills about 6 miles in breadth. We reached the small village of Kers, built on its western extremity, in about 2 hours and a half, and found the chief, surrounded by the principal inhabitants, seated on a raised platform near a well-built stone house. He assured me, stroking a beard of spotless white to confirm his words, that he was above 90 years of age, and had never seen a European before the day of my visit. Half blind, he peered at me through his blear eyes until he had fully satisfied his curiosity, then spoke contemptuously of the Franks, and abused the Tanzimat. The old gentleman, notwithstanding his rough exterior, was hospitable after a fashion, It would not suffer us to depart until we had eaten of every delicacy the village could afford. Leaving the Nazik Gul, we entered an undulating country traversed by very deep ravines, mere channels cut into the sandstone by mountain torrents. The villages are built at the bottom of these gullies, amidst fruit trees and gardens, sheltered by perpendicular rocks and watered by running streams. They are undiscovered until the traveler reaches the very edge of the precipice, when a pleasant and cheerful scene opens suddenly beneath his feet. He would have believed the upper country a mere desert had he not spied here and there in the distance a peasant slowly driving his plough through the rich soil. The inhabitants of this district are more industrious and ingenious than their neighbors. They carry the produce of their interests not on the backs of animals, as in most parts of Asia Minor, but in carts made entirely of wood, no iron used even in the wheels, which are ingeniously built of walnut, oak, and kara agash, literally black tree thorn, the stronger woods being used for rough spokes let into the nave. The plough also differs from that in general use in Asia. To the share are attached 2 parallel boards, about 4 feet long and a foot broad, which separate the soil and leave a deep and well-defined furrow. We rode for 2 or 3 hours on these uplands, until, suddenly reaching the edge of a ravine, a beautiful prospect of a lake, woodland, and mountain opened before us. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Evan F.
Chapter 2 of Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tyrell Sorensen. Chapter 2. The Lake of Wan, Aklat, Tartar Tombs, Ancient Remains, a Dervish, a Friend, the Mudir, Armenian Remains, an Armenian Convent and Bishop, Journey to Bitlis, Nimrud Daug, Bitlis, Journey to Kurzan, Yazidi Village. The first view the traveler obtains of the Lake of Wan on descending towards it from the hills above Aklat is singularly beautiful. This great inland sea of the deepest blue is bounded to the east by ranges of serrated snow-capped mountains peering one above the other and springing here and there into the highest peaks of Tiari and Kurdistan. Beneath them lies the sacred island of Akhtamar, just visible in the distance, like a dark shadow on the water. At the further end rises the one sublime cone of the Subhan, and along the lower part of the eastern shores stretches the Nimrud Daug, varied in shape and rich in local traditions. At our feet, as we drew nigh to the lake, were the gardens of the ancient city of Aklat, leaning minarets and pointed mausoleums peeping above the trees. We rode through the vast burying grounds, a perfect forest of upright stones 7 or 8 feet high of the richest red color, most delicately and tastefully carved with arabesque ornaments and inscriptions in the massive character of the early Musulman age. In the midst of them rose here and there a conical turba of beautiful shape, covered with exquisite tracery. The monuments of the dead still stand and have become the monuments of a city, itself long crumbled into dust. Amidst orchids and gardens are scattered here and there low houses rudely built out of the remains of the earlier habitations, and fragments of cornice and sculpture are piled up into the walls around the cultivated plots. Beyond the turba, said to be that of Sultan Bandur, through a deep ravine such as I have already described, runs a bawling stream, crossed by an old bridge. Orchids and gardens make the bottom of the narrow valley, and the cultivated ledges, as seen from above, a bed of foliage. The lofty perpendicular rocks rising on both sides are literally honeycombed with entrances to artificial caves, ancient tombs, or dwelling places. On a high, isolated mass of sandstone stand the walls and towers of a castle, the remains of the ancient city of Kelath, celebrated in Armenian history, and one of the seats of Armenian power. I descended to the crumbling ruins and examined the excavations in the rocks. The latter are now used as habitations and as stables for herds and flocks. Many of the tombs are approached by flights of steps, also cut in the rock. An entrance, generally square, unless subsequently widened and either perfectly plain or decorated with a simple cornice, opens into a spacious chamber, which frequently leads into others on the same level or by narrow flights of steps into upper rooms. There are no traces of the means by which these entrances were closed. They probably were so by stones, turning on rude hinges or rolling on rollers. Leaving the valley and winding through a forest of fruit trees, here and there interspersed with a few primitive dwellings, I came to the old Turkish castle, standing on the very edge of the lake. It is a pure Ottoman edifice, less ancient than the turbas, or the old walls towering above the ravine. Inscriptions over the gateways state that it was partly built by Sultan Salim and partly by Sultan Suleiman, and over the northern entrance occurs the date of 975 of the Hijra. In the fort there dwelt, until very recently, a notorious Kurdish freebooter of the name of Muhammad Bey, who, secure in his stronghold, ravaged the surrounding country and sorely vexed its Christian inhabitants. He fled on the approach of the Turkish troops after their successful expedition against Nur-ul Bey and is supposed to be wandering in the mountains of southern Kurdistan. The ancient city of Kelath was the capital of the Armenian province of Peznauni. It came under the Mohammedan power as early as the 9th century, but was conquered by the Greeks of the Lower Empire at the end of the 10th. The Seljuks took it from them, and it then again became a Mussulman principality. It was long a place of contention for the early Arab and Tartar conquerors. Shah Arman reduced it towards the end of the 12th century. He was besieged without result by the celebrated Salah ad-Din and was finally captured by his nephew, the son of Malik Adil, in AD 1207. The sun was setting as I returned to the tents. The whole scene was lighted up with its golden tints, and Claude never composed a subject more beautiful than was here furnished by nature herself. I was seated outside my tent, gazing listlessly on the scene, when I was roused by a well-remembered cry, but one which I had not heard for years. I turned about and saw standing before me a Persian dervish, clothed in a fawn-colored gazelle skin and wearing the conical red cap, edged with fur and embroidered in black braid with verses from the Quran and invocations to Ali, the patron of his sect. He was no less surprised than I had been at his greeting when I gave him the answer peculiar to men of his order. He was my devoted friend and servant from that moment, and sent his boy to fetch a dish of pears, for which he actually refused a present 10 times their value. Whilst we were seated chatting in the soft moonlight, Hormuzd was suddenly embraced by a young man resplendent with silk and gold embroidery and armed to the teeth. He was a chief from the district of Mosul, and well known to us. Hearing of our arrival, he had hastened from his village at some distance to welcome us, and to endeavor to persuade me to move the encampment and partake of his hospitality. Failing, of course, in prevailing upon me to change my quarters for the night, he sent his servant to his wife, who was a lady of Mosul, and formerly a friend of my companions, for a sheep. We found ourselves thus unexpectedly amongst friends. Our circle was further increased by Christians and Mussulmans of Aklat, and the night was far spent before we retired to rest. In the morning, soon after sunrise, I renewed my wanderings amongst the ruins, first calling upon the mudir, or governor, who received me seated under his own fig tree. He was an old greybeard, a native of the place, and of a straightforward, honest bearing. I had to listen to the usual complaints of poverty and overtaxation, although, after all, the village with its extensive gardens only contributed yearly 10 purses, or less than £45, to the public revenue. This sum seems small enough, but without trade, and distant from any high road, there is not a parah of ready money, according to the mudir, in the place. From the mudir's house, I rode to the more ancient part of the city, and to the rock tombs. I entered many of these, and found all of them to be of the same character, though varying in size. Amongst them there are galleries and passages in the cliffs without apparent use, and flights of steps, cut out of the rock, which seem to lead nowhere. I searched and inquired in vain for inscriptions and remains of sculpture, and yet the place is of undoubted antiquity, and in the immediate vicinity of contemporary sites where cuneiform inscriptions do exist. During my wanderings, I entered an Armenian church and convent standing on the ledge of rock overhanging the stream, about 4 miles up the southern ravine. The convent was tenanted by a bishop and 2 priests. They dwelt in a small low room, scarcely lighted by a hole carefully blocked up with a sheet of oiled paper to shut out the cold. Dark, musty, and damp, a very parish clerk in England would have shuddered at the sight of such a residence. Their bed, a carpet worn to threads, spread on the rotten boards. Their diet, the coarsest sandy bread and a little sour curds with beans and mangy meat for a jubilee. A miserable old woman sat in a kind of vault under the staircase preparing their food and passing her days in pushing to and fro with her skinny hands the goat skin containing the milk to be shaken into butter. She was the housekeeper and handmaiden of the episcopal establishment. The church was somewhat higher, though even darker than the dwelling room, and was partly used to store a heap of moldy corn and some primitive agricultural implements. The whole was well and strongly built, and had the evident marks of antiquity. The bishop showed me a rude cross carved on a rock outside the convent, which, he declared, had been cut by one of the disciples of the Saviour himself. It is, at any rate, considered a relic of very great sanctity, and is an object of pilgrimage for the surrounding Christian population. On my return to our encampment, the tents were struck, and the caravan had already begun its march. Time would not permit me to delay, and with a deep longing to linger on this favored spot, I slowly followed the road leading along the margin of the Lake Tubitless. I've seldom seen a fairer scene, one richer in natural beauties. The artist and the lover of nature may equally find at Aklat objects of study and delight. The architect, or the traveler, interested in the history of that graceful and highly original branch of art, which attained its full perfection under the Arab rulers of Egypt and Spain, should extend his journey to the remains of ancient Armenian cities, far from high roads and mostly unexplored. He would then trace how that architecture, deriving its name from Byzantium, had taken the same development in the East as it did in the West, and how its subsequent combination with the elaborate decoration, the varied outline, and tasteful coloring of Persia had produced the style termed Saracenic, Arabic, and Moresque. He would discover, almost daily, details, ornaments, and forms, recalling to his mind the various orders of architecture, which, at an early period, succeeded to each other in Western Europe and in England, modifications of style for which we are mainly indebted to the East during its close union with the West by bond of Christianity. The Crusaders, too, brought back into Christendom, on their return from Asia, a taste for that rich and harmonious union of color and architecture which had already been so successfully introduced by the Arabs into the countries they had conquered. Our road skirted the foot of the Nimrud Dagh, which stretches from Aklat to the southern extremity of the lake. We crossed several dikes of lava and scoria, with wide mud torrents now dry, the outpourings of a volcano long since extinct. Our road gradually led away from the lake. With Kawal Yusuf and my companions, I left the caravan far behind. The night came on, and we were shrouded in darkness. We sought in vain for the village which was to afford us a resting place, and soon lost our uncertain track. The Kawal took the opportunity of relating tales collected during former journeys on this spot of robber Kurds and murdered travelers, which did not tend to remove the anxiety felt by some of my party. At length, after wandering to and fro for about an hour, we heard the distant jingle of the caravan bells. We rode in the direction of the welcome sound and soon found ourselves at the Armenian village of Keswak, standing in a small bay and sheltered by a rocky promontory jutting boldly into the lake. Next morning, we rode along the margin of the lake, still crossing the spurs of the Nimrud Dagh, furrowed by numerous streams of lava and mud. In one of the deep gullies, opening from the mountain to the water's edge, are a number of isolated masses of sandstone, worn into fantastic shapes by the winter torrents which sweep down from the hills. The people of the country call them the Camels of Nimrod. Tradition says that the rebellious patriarch, endeavoring to build an inaccessible castle, strong enough to defy both God and man, the Almighty, to punish his arrogance, turned the workmen, as they were working, into stone. The rocks on the border of the lake are the camels who, with their burdens, were petrified into a perpetual memorial of the divine vengeance. The unfinished walls of the castle are still to be seen on the top of the mountain, and the surrounding country, the seat of a primeval race, abounds in similar traditions. We left the southern end of the lake, near the Armenian village of Tadwan, once a place of some importance, and soon entered a rugged ravine, worn by the mountain rills collected into a large stream. This was one of the many headwaters of the Tigris. It was flowing tumultuously to our own bourne, and, as we gazed upon the troubled waters, they seemed to carry us nearer to our journey's end. The ravine was at first wild and rocky. Cultivated spots next appeared, scattered in the dry bed of the torrent. Then a few gigantic trees, gardens, and orchards followed, and at length the narrow valley opened on the long, straggling town of Bitlis. The governor here had provided quarters for us in a large house belonging to an Armenian who had been tailor to Badar Khan Bey. My party was now, for the first time during the journey, visited with that curse of Eastern travel, fever and ague. The doctor was prostrate, and having then no experience of the malady, at once had dreams of typhus and malignant fever. A day's rest was necessary, and our jaded horses needed it as well as we, for there were bad mountain roads and long marches before us. I had a further object in remaining. This was, to obtain indemnity for the robbery committed on some relations of Kawal Yusuf 2 years before. The official order of Rashid Pasha, the governor's intervention, speedily effected the desired arrangement. The governor ordered Kawases to accompany me through the town. I had been told that ancient inscriptions existed in the castle or on the rock, but I searched in vain for them. Those pointed out to me were early Mohammedan. Bitlis contains many picturesque remains of mosques, baths, and bridges, and was once a place of considerable size and importance. It is built in the very bottom of a deep valley and on the sides of ravines worn by small tributaries of the Tigris. The export trade is chiefly supplied by the produce of the mountains: galls, honey, wax, wool, and carpets and stuffs, woven and dyed in the tents. The dyes of Kurdistan, and particularly those from the districts around Bitlis, Sirte, and Jazira, are celebrated for their brilliancy. They are made from herbs gathered in the mountains, and from indigo, yellow berries, and other materials imported into the country. The carpets are of a rich, soft texture, the patterns displaying considerable elegance and taste. They are much esteemed in Turkey. There was a fair show of Manchester goods and coarse English cutlery in the shops. The sale of arms, once extensively carried on, had been prohibited. Having examined the town, I visited the Armenian bishop, who dwells in a large convent in one of the ravines branching off from the main valley. On my way, I passed several hot springs, some gurgling up in the very bed of the torrent. The bishop was maudlin, old, and decrepit. He cried over his own personal woes and over those of his community, abused the Turks and the American missionaries, whispering confidentially in my ear as if the Kurds were at his door. He insisted in the most endearing terms, and occasionally throwing his arms round my neck, that I should drink a couple glasses of fiery Rocky, although it was still early morning, pledging me himself in each glass. He showed me his church, an ancient building, well hung with miserable daubs of saints and miracles. There are 3 roads from Bitlis to Jazira, 2 over the mountains through Sirte, generally frequented by caravans, but very difficult and precipitous. A 3rd, more circuitous, and winding through the valleys of the eastern branch of the Tigris. I chose the last, as it enabled me to visit the Yazidi villages of the district of Kurzan. We left Bitlis on the 20th. About 5 miles from Bitlis, the road is carried by a tunnel, about 20 feet in length, through a mass of calcareous rock projecting like a huge rib from the mountain's side. The mineral stream, which in the lapse of ages has formed this deposit, is still at work, projecting great stalactites from its sides and threatening to close ere long the tunnel itself. There is no inscription to record by whom and at what period this passage was cut. We continued during the following day in the same ravine, crossing by ancient bridges the stream, which was gradually gathering strength as it advanced towards the low country. About noon, we passed a large Kurdish village called Goina, belonging to Sheikh Qasim, one of those religious fanatics who are the curse of Kurdistan. He was notorious for his hatred of the Yazidis. On those districts he had committed numerous depredations, murdering those who came within his reach. His last expedition had not proved successful. He was repulsed with the loss of many of his followers. We encamped in the afternoon on the bank of the torrent, near a cluster of Kurdish tents, concealed from view by brushwood and high reeds. The owners were poor but hospitable, bringing us a lamb, yogurt, and milk. Late in the evening, a party of horsemen rode to our encampment. They were a young Kurdish chief, with his retainers, carrying off a girl with whom he had fallen in love, not an uncommon occurrence in Kurdistan. They dismounted, ate bread, and then hastened on their journey to escape pursuit. Starting next morning, soon after dawn, we rode for 2 hours along the banks of the stream, and then, turning from the valley, entered a country of low, undulating hills. We halted for a few minutes in the village of Omais el-Quran, belonging to one of the innumerable saints of the Kurdish mountains. The sheikh himself was on the terrace superintending the repair of his house, gratuitously undertaken by the neighboring villagers, who came eagerly to engage in a good and pious work. Leaving a small plain, we ascended a low range of hills by a precipitous pathway and halted on the summit at a Kurdish village named Koki. It was filled with Bashi Bozuks, or irregular troops, collecting the revenue, and there was such a general confusion, quarreling of men and screaming of women, that we could scarcely get bread to eat. Yet the officer assured me that the whole sum to be raised amounted to no more than 70 piastres, about 13 shillings. The poverty of the village must indeed have been extreme, or the bad will of the inhabitants outrageous. It was evening before we descended into the plain country of the district of Kurzan. The Yazidi village of Hamki had been visible for some time from the heights, and we turned towards it. As the sun was fast sinking, the peasants were leaving the threshing floor and gathering together their implements of husbandry. They saw the large company of horsemen drawing nigh, and took us for irregular troops, the terror of an eastern village. Kuwal Yusuf, concealing all but his eyes with the Arab keffiyeh which he then wore, rode into the midst of them and demanded in a peremptory voice provisions and quarters for the night. The poor creatures huddled together, unwilling to grant, yet fearing to refuse. The Kuwal, having enjoyed their alarm for a moment, threw his kerchief from his face, exclaiming, "O evil ones, will you refuse bread to your priest, and turn him hungry from your door?" There was surely then no unwillingness to receive us. Casting aside their shovels and forks, the men threw themselves upon the Kuwal, each struggling to kiss his hand. The news spread rapidly, and the rejoicing was so great that the village was alive with merriment and feasting. Yusuf was soon seated in the midst of a circle of the elders. He told his whole history with such details and illustrations as an Eastern alone can introduce to bring every fact vividly before his listeners. Nothing was omitted. His arrival at Constantinople, his reception by me, his introduction to the ambassador, his interview with the great ministers of state, the firman of future protection for the Yazidis, prospect of peace and happiness for the tribe, our departure from the capital, the nature of steamboats, the tossing of the waves, the pains of seasickness, and our journey to Curzan. Not the smallest particular was forgotten, and when he had finished, it was my turn to be the object of unbounded welcomes and salutations. As the Kual sat on the ground, with his noble features and flowing robes, surrounded by the elders of the village, eager listeners to every word which dropped from their priest, and looking towards him with looks of profound veneration, the picture brought vividly to my mind many scenes described in the sacred volumes. Let the painter who would throw off the conventionalities of the age, who would feel as well as portray the incidents of Holy Writ, wander in the East and mix, not as the ordinary traveler, but as a student of men and of nature with its people. He will daily meet with customs which he will otherwise be at a loss to understand, and be brought face to face with those who have retained with little change the manners, language, and dress of a patriarchal race. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tyrell Sorensen. Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon by Austen Layard. Chapter 3. Reception by the Yazidis. Village of Gezelder. Triumphal March to Redwan. Armenian Church. The Melek Taus, or Brazen Bird. Tile. Valley of the Tigris. Bas-reliefs. Journey to Daraboin. To Samil. Abde Aga. Journey to Mosul. The Yazidi Chiefs. Arrival at Mosul. Xenophon's march from Zab to the Black Sea. I was awoke on the following morning by the tread of horses and the noise of many voices. The good people of Hamki, having sent messengers in the night to the surrounding villages to spread the news of our arrival, a large body of Yazidis on horse and on foot had already assembled, although it was not yet dawn, to greet us and escort us on our journey. They were dressed in the gayest garments and had adorned their turbans with flowers and green leaves. Their chief was Akko, a warrior well known to the Yazidi wars, still active and daring, although his beard had long turned gray. The head of the village of Gezeldir, with the principal inhabitants, had come to invite me to eat bread in his house, and we followed him. As we rode along, we were joined by parties of horsemen and footmen, each man kissing my hand as he arrived, and the horsemen alighting for that purpose. Before we reached Gezeldir, the procession had swollen to many hundreds. The men had assembled at some distance from the village, the women and children dressed in their holiday attire and carrying boughs of trees, congregated on the housetops. Soon after our arrival, several fakirs, in their dark coarse dresses and red and black turbans, came to us from the neighboring villages. Other chiefs and horsemen also flocked in, and were invited to join in the feast, which was not, however, served up until Kuwal Yusuf had related his whole history once more, without omitting a single detail. After we had eaten of stuffed lambs, pilaus, and savory dishes and most luscious grapes, the produce of the district, our entertainer placed a present of homemade carpets at my feet, and we rose to depart. The horsemen, the fakirs, and the principal inhabitants of Gezelder on foot accompanied me. At a short distance from the village, we were met by another large body of Yazidis and by many Jacobites. A bishop and several priests were with him. 2 hours' ride with this great company, the horsemen galloping to and fro, the footmen discharging their firearms, brought us to the village of Koshana. The whole of the population, mostly dressed in pure white and wearing leaves and flowers in their turbans, had turned out to meet us. Women stood on the roadside with jars of fresh water and bowls of sour milk, whilst others with the children were assembled on the housetops making the talel. Resisting an invitation to alight and eat bread, and having merely stopped to exchange salutations with those who assembled, I continued on the road to Redwan, our party swollen by a fresh accession of followers from the village. As we passed through the defile leading into the plain of Redwan, we had the appearance of a triumphal procession, but as we approached the small town, a still more enthusiastic reception awaited us. First came a large body of horsemen collected from the place itself and the neighboring villages. They were followed by Yazidis on foot, carrying flowers and branches of trees, and preceded by musicians playing on the tabul and zernai. Next were the Armenian community, headed by their clergy, and then the Jacobite and other Christian sects, also with their respective priests. The women and children lined the entrance to the place and thronged the housetops. I alighted amidst the din of music and the Talel at the house of Nazi, the chief of the whole Yazidi district, 2 sheep being slain before me as I took my feet from the stirrups. I took up my quarters in the Armenian church, dining in the evening with the chiefs to witness the festivities. The change was indeed grateful to me, and I found at length a little repose and leisure to reflect upon the gratifying scene to which I had that day been witness. I have, perhaps, been too minute in the account of my reception at Redwan, but I record with pleasure this instance of a sincere and spontaneous display of gratitude on the part of a much maligned and oppressed race. To those, unfortunately too many, who believe that Easterns can only be managed by violence and swayed by fear, let this record be a proof that there are high and generous feelings which may not only be relied and acted upon without interfering with their authority or compromising their dignity, but with every hope of laying the foundation of real attachment and mutual esteem. The church stands on the slope of a mound, on the summit of which are the ruins of a castle belonging to the former chiefs of Redwan. It was built expressly for the Christians of the Armenian sect by Mirza Aga, the last semi-independent Yazidi chief, a pleasing example of toleration and liberality well worthy of imitation by more civilized men. Service was performed in the open Iwan, or large vaulted chamber, during the afternoon, the congregation kneeling uncovered in the yard. The priests of the different communities called upon me as soon as I was ready to receive their visits. The most intelligent amongst them was a Roman Catholic Chaldean, a good-humored, tolerant fellow, who, with a very small congregation of his own, did not bear any ill will to his neighbors. With the principal Yazidi chiefs, too, I had a long and interesting conversation on the state of their people and on their projects. Redwan is called a town because it has a bazaar and is the chief place of a considerable district. It may contain about 800 rudely built huts and stands on a large stream which joins the Deir Bakir branch of the Tigris, about 5 or 6 miles below. The inhabitants are Yazidis, with the exception of about 100 Armenian and 40 or 50 Jacobite and Chaldean families. A Turkish mudir or petty governor generally resides in the place, but was absent at the time of my visit. We slept in a long room opening on the courtyard and were awoke long before daybreak by the jingling of small bells and the mumbling of priests. It was Sunday, and the Armenians commenced their church services betimes. I gazed half dozing, and without rising from my bed, upon the ceremonies, the bowing, raising of crosses, and shaking of bells, which continued for above 3 hours, until priests and congregation must have been well nigh exhausted. The people, as during the previous afternoon service, stood and knelt uncovered in the courtyard. The Qawwals, who are sent yearly by Hussein Bey and Sheikh Nasir to instruct the Yazidis in their faith, and to collect the contributions forming the revenues of the great chief, and of the tomb of Sheikh Adi, were now in Redwan. The same Qawwals do not take the same rounds every year. The Yazidis are parceled out into 4 divisions for the purpose of these annual visitations. Those of the Sinjir, of Kurzan, of the Pashilik of Aleppo, and of the villages in northern Armenia, and within the Russian frontiers. The Yazidis of the Mosul districts have the Qawwals always amongst them. I was aware that on the occasion of these journeys, the priests carry with them the celebrated Malik Taus, or brazen peacock, as a warrant for their mission. As this was a favorable opportunity, I asked and obtained a sight of this mysterious figure. A stand of bright copper or brass, in the shape like the candlesticks generally used in Mosul and Baghdad, was surmounted by the rude image of a bird in the same metal, and more like an Indian or Mexican idol than a cock or peacock. Its peculiar workmanship indicated some antiquity, but I could see no traces of inscription upon it. Before it stood a copper bowl to receive contributions and a bag to contain the bird and stand, which takes to pieces when carried from place to place. There are 4 such images, one for each district visited by the Qawwals. The Yazidis declare that, notwithstanding the frequent wars and massacres to which the sect has been exposed, and the plunder and murder of the priests during their journeys, no Malek Taus has ever fallen into the hands of the Mussulmans. Mr. Hormuz Rassam was alone permitted to visit the image with me. As I have elsewhere observed, it is not looked upon as an idol, but as a symbol or banner, as Sheikh Nasir termed it, of the house of Hussein Bey. Having breakfasted at Naziz's house, we left Redwan, followed by a large company of Yazidis, whom I had great difficulty in persuading to turn back about 3 or 4 miles from the town. My party was increased by a very handsome black and tan greyhound with long silky hair, a present from old Akko, the Yazidi chief. Tawar, for such was the dog's name, soon forgot his old masters and formed an equal attachment for his new. Qawwal Yusuf and the Yazidi chiefs had sent messengers even to Hussein Bey to apprise him of our coming. As they traveled along, they scattered the news through the country, and I was received outside every village by its inhabitants. At Tilla, the united waters of Bitlis, Sirte, and the upper districts of Botan join the western branch of the Tigris. The 2 streams are about equal in size, and at this time of year both fordable in certain places. We crossed the lower, or eastern, which we found wide and exceedingly rapid, the water, however, not reaching above the saddle girths. The spot at which we crossed was one of peculiar interest. It was here that the 10,000 in their memorable retreat forded this river, called by Xenophon the Centritus. The Greeks, having fought their way over the lofty mountains of the Carduchians, found their further progress towards Armenia arrested by a rapid stream. The ford was deep, and its passage disputed by a formidable force of Armenians, Mygdonians, and Chaldeans, drawn up on an eminence 300 or 400 feet from the river. In this strait, Xenophon dreamt that he was in chains, and that suddenly his fetters burst asunder of their own accord. His dream was fulfilled when two youths casually found a more practicable ford, by which the army, after a skillful stratagem on the part of their commander, safely reached the opposite bank. The sun had set before our baggage had been crossed, and we sought by the light of the moon the difficult track along the Tigris, where the river forces its way to the low country of Assyria through a long, narrow, and deep gorge. Huge rocks rose perpendicularly on either side, broken into many fantastic shapes, and throwing their dark shadows over the water. In some places they scarcely left room for the river to pursue its course, and then a footpath, hardly wide enough to admit the loaded mules, was carried along a mere ledge overhanging the gurgling stream. The gradual deepening of this outlet during countless centuries is strikingly shown by the ledges which jut out like a succession of cornices from the sides of the cliffs. The last ledge left by the retiring waters formed our pathway. We found no village until we reached Chelek. The place had been deserted by its inhabitants for the Yilaks, or mountain pastures. For 3 hours during the following morning, we followed the bold and majestic ravine of the Tigris, scenes rivaling each other in grandeur and beauty opening at every turn. Leaving the river, where it makes a sudden bend to the northward, we commenced a steep ascent, and in an hour and a half reached the Christian village of Kuwara. We rested during the heat of the day under the grateful shade of a grove of trees, and in the afternoon we stood on the brink of the great platform of Central Asia. Beneath us were the vast plains of Mesopotamia, lost in the hazy distance, the undulating land between them and the Taurus confounded, from so great a height, with the plains themselves. The hills of Sinjar and Zako, like ridges on an embossed map, the Tigris and the Kabur, winding through the low country to their place of junction at Darabun. To the right, facing the setting sun and catching its last rays, the high cone of Mardin. Behind, a confused mass of peaks, some snow-capped, all rugged and broken, of the lofty mountains of Botan and Malateya, between them and the northern range of Taurus, the deep ravine of the river and the valley of Redwan. I watched the shadows as they lengthened over the plain, melting one by one into the general gloom, and then descended to the large Kurdish village of Funduk, whose inhabitants, during the rule of Badr Khan Bey, were notorious amongst even the savage tribes of Botan for their hatred and insolence to Christians. Although we had now nothing to fear, I preferred seeking another spot for our night's halt, but this was not permitted by Rasul Kiya, who sent after us, and was so urgent in his hospitality that we were compelled to pass the night in the village. The Kurds of Funduk wear the Botan dress in its full perfection, a turban nearly 3 feet in diameter, shalwars or trousers of enormous width, loose embroidered jackets, and shirt sleeves sweeping the ground, all being striped deep dull red and black, except the underlinen and one kerchief tied diagonally across the turban, which is generally of bright yellow. They are armed, too, to the teeth, and as they crouched round the fires on the housetops, their savage countenances peering through the gloom, my London companion, unused to such scenes, might well have fancied himself in a den of thieves. The Kiya, notwithstanding his bad reputation, was exact in all the duties of hospitality. The supper was abundant, the coffee flowed perpetually, and he satisfied my curiosity upon many points of revenue, internal administration, tribe history, and local curiosities. We passed the night on the roof without any adventure, and resumed our journey before dawn on the following morning, to the great relief of Mr. C, who rejoiced to feel himself well out of the hands of such dangerous hosts. Crossing a mountain wooded with dwarf oaks by a very difficult pathway, carried along and over rocks containing many excavated tombs, we descended to Phoenique, a village on the Tigris, supposed to occupy the site of an ancient town, Phoenicia. After we had breakfasted, some Kurds who had gathered round us offered to take me to a rock sculptured, they said, with unknown Frank figures. We rode up the narrow and shady ravine, through which leapt a brawling torrent, watering fruit trees and melon beds. The rocks on both sides were honeycombed with tombs. The bas-relief is somewhat above the line of cultivation and is surrounded by excavated chambers. It consists of 2 figures, dressed in loose vests and trousers, one apparently resting his hand on the shoulder of the other. There are the remains of an inscription, but too much weather-worn to be copied with any accuracy. The costume of the figures and the forms of the characters, as far as they can be distinguished, prove that the tablet belongs to the Parthian period. We quitted Finnick in the afternoon. Accompanied by Kual Yusuf and Mr. C, I left the caravan to examine some rock sculptures in a valley leading from Jazira to Dergile, the former stronghold of Badr Khan Bey. The sculptures are about 2 miles from the high road, near a small fort built by Mir Saif ed-Din and now occupied by a garrison of Arnauts. There are 2 tablets, one above the other. The upper contains a warrior on horseback, the lower a single figure. Although no traces of inscription remain, the bas-reliefs may confidently be assigned to the same period as that at Finnick. We found the caravan at Mansuria, where they had established themselves for the night. This is one of the very few Nestorian Chaldean villages of the plains which has not gone over to the Roman Catholic faith. It contains a church and supports a priest. The inhabitants complained much of oppression, and unfortunately, chiefly from brother Christians, formerly of their own creed. I was much struck with the intelligence and beauty of the children. One boy, scarcely 12 years of age, was already a shamasha, or deacon, and could read with ease the scriptures and the commentaries. We left Mansuraya at 4 in the morning, passing Jazira about dawn, its towers and walls just visible through the haze on the opposite bank of the Tigris. Shortly after, we were unexpectedly met by a number of Yazidi horsemen, from whom we learnt that the country was in a very disturbed state on account of the incursions of the desert Arabs. But as a strong party was waiting to accompany us to Samil, I determined upon taking the shorter, though more dangerous and less frequented, road by Dirabaun. This road, impracticable to caravans except when the river Kabur is fordable, winds round the spur of the Zakho hills and thus avoids a difficult and precipitous pass. Dirabaun is a large Yazidi village standing on the western spur of the Zakho range. Numerous springs burst from the surrounding rocks and irrigate extensive rice grounds. Below is the large Christian village of Feshapur, where there is a ferry across the Tigris. We were most hospitably entertained by the Yazidi chief, one of the horsemen who had met us near Jazira. We mounted our horses as the moon rose, and resumed our journey accompanied by a strong escort, which left us when we were within 5 or 6 miles of Samil. It was late in the forenoon before we reached our halting place, after a dreary and fatiguing ride. We were now fairly in the Assyrian plains. The heat was intense, that heavy heat which seems to paralyze all nature, causing the very air itself to vibrate. The high artificial mound of the Yazidi village, crowned by a modern mud-built castle, had been visible in the distance long before we reached it, miraged into double its real size and into an imposing group of towers and fortifications. Almost overcome with weariness, we toiled up to it and found its owner, Abdi Aga, the Yazidi chieftain, seated in the gate, a vaulted entrance with deep recesses on both sides, used as places of assembly for business during the day and as places of rest for guests during the night. He was of tall, commanding figure with the deepest and most powerful voice I had ever heard. We arrived earlier than he had expected, our forced march from Dirabaun having saved us some hours, and he apologized for not having ridden out to meet us. His reception was most hospitable, the lamb was slain and the feast prepared. But a sudden attack by the Bedouin on a neighboring village obliged him to reluctantly leave us and be absent during our stay. Being urged to depart, through apprehension of the Bedouin, we pushed forward when suddenly a large body of horsemen appeared on a rising ground to the east of us. We could scarcely expect Arabs from that quarter, however, all our party was made ready for an attack. Kual Yusuf and myself, being the best mounted, rode towards them to reconnoiter. Then 1 or 2 horsemen advanced warily from the opposite party. We neared each other. Yusuf spied the well-known black turban, dashed forward with a shout of joy, and in a moment we were surrounded and in the embrace of friends. Hussein Bey and Sheikh Nazir, with the Kuals and Yazidi elders, had ridden nearly 40 miles through the night to meet and escort me, if needful, to Mosul. Their delight at seeing us knew no bounds, nor was I less touched at the display of gratitude and good feeling, equally unexpected and sincere. They rode with us as far as Tel Eskaf, where the danger from the Arabs ceased, and I was now once more with old friends. In the afternoon, as we rode towards Tel Kef, I left the high road with Hormuzd to drink water at some Arab tents. As we approached, we were greeted with exclamations of joy, and were soon in the midst of a crowd of men and women, kissing our knees and exhibiting other tokens of welcome. They were Jeburs, who had been employed in the excavations. Hearing that we were again going to dig after old stones, they once set about striking their tents to join us at Mosul or Nimrud. As we neared Tel Kef, we found groups of my old superintendents and workmen by the roadside. There were Fat Toma, Mansour, Benin, and Hana, joyful at meeting me once more and at the prospect of fresh service. In the village we found Mr. Rassam, the vice-consul, and Koja Toma, his dragoman, who had made ready the feast for us at the house of the Chaldean bishop. Next morning, as we rode the last 3 hours of our journey, we met fresh groups of familiar faces. Then as we ascend an eminence midway, walls, towers, minarets, and domes rise boldly from the margin of the broad river, cheating us into belief, too soon to be dispelled, that Mosul is still a not unworthy representative of the great Nineveh. As we draw near, the long line of lofty mounds, the only remains of mighty bulwarks and spacious gates, detach themselves from the low undulating hills. Now the vast mound of Koyunjik overtops the surrounding heaps. Then above it peers the white cone of the tomb of the prophet Jonah. Many other well-remembered spots follow in rapid succession, but we cannot linger. Hastening over the creaking bridge of boats, we force our way through the crowded bazaars and alight at the house I had left 2 years ago. Old servants take their places as a matter of course and, uninvited, pursue their regular occupations as if they had never been interrupted. Indeed, it seemed as if we had but returned from a summer's ride. 2 years had passed away like a dream. I may in this place add a few words on the part of the route pursued by Xenophon and the 10,000 during their memorable retreat, the identification of which had been one of my principal objects during our journey. I have, in the course of my narrative, already pointed out 1 or 2 spots signaled by remarkable events on their march. I must first state my conviction that the Parsong, like its representative, the modern Farsong or Farsakh of Persia, was not a measure of distance very accurately determined, but rather indicated a certain amount of time employed in traveling a given space. That Xenophon reckoned by the common mode of computation of the country is evident, by his employing, almost always, the Persian parasong instead of the Greek stadium, and that the parasong was the same as the modern hour, we find by the distance between Larissa, Nimrud, and Mespila, Koyunjuk, being given as 6 parasongs, corresponding exactly with the number of hours assigned by the present inhabitants of the country and by the authorities of the Turkish post to the same road. The 6 hours in this instance are equal to about 18 English miles. The ford, by which the Greeks crossed the Great Zabates, may, I think, be accurately determined. It is still the principal ford in this part of the river and must, from the nature of the bed of the stream, have been so from the earliest periods. It is about 25 miles from the confluence of the Zab and the Tigris. The Greeks could not have crossed the Zab above the spot I have indicated, as the bed above the river is deep and confined within high rocky banks. They might have done so below the junction of the Gazir, and a ravine worn by winter rains may correspond with the valley mentioned by Xenophon, but I think the Gazir is far more likely to have been the torrent bed viewed with so much alarm by the Greek commander, and the passage of which Mithridates might have disputed with some prospect of success. That Larissa and Mespila are represented by the ruins of Nimrud and Koyunjuk no one can reasonably doubt. Xenophon's description corresponds most accurately with the ruins and with the distance between them. From Mespila, the Greeks marched 4 parasongs and probably halted near the modern village of Batnai, between Tel Kef and Tel Eskaf, an ancient site exactly 4 hours, by the usual caravan road, from Koyunjuk. Instead of fording the Kabur near its junction with the Tigris and thus avoiding the hills, they crossed them by a precipitous pass to the site of modern Zakko. They reached this range in 4 days, traversing it on the 5th, probably by the modern caravan road. They were probably much retarded during this last day by having to fight their way over 3 distinct mountain ridges. It is remarkable that Xenophon does not mention the Kahur, although he must have crossed that river either by a ford or by a bridge before reaching the plain. Yet the stream is broad and rapid, and the fords at all times deep. Nor does he allude to the Hazel, a confluent of the Kabur, to which he came during his first day's march after leaving Zakko. These omissions prove that he does not give an accurate itinerary of his route. 4 days' march, the first of only 60 stadia, or about 7 miles, brought the Greeks to the high mountains of Kurdistan, which, meeting the Tigris, shut out all further advance except by difficult and precipitous passes, already occupied by the Persians. Xenophon, having dislodged the enemy from the first ridge, returned to the main body of the army, which had remained on the plain. This must have been near Finik, where the very foot of the Kurdish mountains is first washed by the river. The spot agrees accurately with Xenophon's description, as it does with the distance. The Greeks, he says, come to a place where the river Tigris is, both from its depth and breadth, absolutely impassable. No road appeared, no craggy mountain of the Kardukians hanging over the river. Xenophon preferred the route across the mountains of Kurdistan, as it led into Armenia, a country from which they might choose their own road to the sea, and which abounded in villages and the necessaries of life. Beyond the Kardukian mountains there were, according to the prisoners, 2 roads into Armenia, one crossing the headwaters of the principal branch of the Tigris, the other going round them, that is, leaving them to the left. These are the roads to this day followed by caravans, one crossing the plains of Kurzan to Diyarbakir, and thence, by well-known mountain passes to Karput, the other passing through Bitlis. Xenophon chose the latter. The villages in the valleys and recesses of the mountains are still found around Funduk. And, on their first day's march over the Carduchian hills, the Greeks probably reached the neighborhood of this village. There now remained about 10 parsangs to the plain through which flows the eastern branch of the Tigris, but the country was difficult, and at this time of the year, nearly midwinter, the lower road along the river was impassable. The Greeks had, therefore, to force their way over a series of difficult passes, all stoutly defended by warlike tribes. They were consequently 4 days in reaching the Centritis, or eastern Tigris, the united waters of the rivers of Bitlis, Sirte, and Botan. It was impossible to cross that river at this spot in the face of the enemy. At length, a ford was discovered higher up, and Xenophon, by skillful strategy, effected the passage. This must have been a short distance from Tilla, as the river, narrowed between rocky banks, is no longer fordable higher up. Owing to the frequent incursions of the Carduchi, the villages along the banks of the Bitlis had been abandoned, and the Greeks were compelled to turn to the westward to find provisions and habitations. Still, there was no road into Armenia, particularly at this time of year, for an army encumbered with baggage, except that through the Bitlis Valley. The remains of an ancient causeway are even now to be traced, and this has probably always been the great thoroughfare between western Armenia and the Assyrian plains. Xenophon consequently made nearly the same detour as I had made on my way from Constantinople. 6 marches, of 5 parasangs each, brought them to the small river Teleboas, which I believe to have been the river of Bitlis. After crossing the low country of Kurzan, well described by Xenophon as a plain varied by hills of an easy ascent, the Greeks must necessarily have turned slightly to the eastward to reach the Bitlis Valley, as inaccessible mountains stopped all further progress. My caravan was 33 hours in journeying from Bitlis to Tella, corresponding exactly with the 6 days' march of the Greeks. They probably came to the river somewhat below the site of the modern town, where it well deserves the epithet of beautiful. It may have then had, as at this day, many villages near its banks. It will be observed that Xenophon says that they came to, not that they crossed, the Teleboas. From this river they reached the Euphrates in 6 marches, making, as usual, 5 parasangs each day. In all, 30 parasangs, or hours. I believe, therefore, that, after issuing from the valley of Bitlis, Xenophon turned to the westward, leaving the lake of Wan a little to the right, though completely concealed from him by a range of low hills. Skirting the western foot of the Nimrud Dog range, he passed through a plain thickly inhabited, abounding in well-provisioned villages, and crossed here and there by ranges of hills. This country still tallies precisely with Xenophon's description. We have not, I conceive, sufficient data in Xenophon's narrative to identify with any degree of certainty his route after crossing the Euphrates. We know that about 20 parasangs from that river the Greeks encamped near a hot spring, and this spring might be recognized in one of many which abound in the country. It is most probable that the Greeks still took the road still used by caravans through the plains of Hinnis and Hassan Kala as offering the fewest difficulties. But what rivers are we to identify with the Phasis and Harpasus? The distance between the Euphrates and Phasis being 70 parasangs, and between the Phasis and Harpasus 95, and the Harpasus being the larger of the 2 rivers. I am on the whole inclined to believe that either the Greeks took a very tortuous course after leaving the Euphrates, making daily but little actual progress towards the great end of their arduous journey, the seacoast, or that there is a considerable error in the amount of parasangs given by Xenophon, that the Harpasus must be the Cheruk, and the Phasis either the Araxes or the Kur, and that Mount Thecus, the holy mountain from which the Greeks beheld the sea, was between Batun and Trebizond, the army having followed the valley of the Cheruk, but leaving it before reaching the site of the modern port on the Black Sea. End of Chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of Discoveries among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sim. Discoveries among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon by Austen Layard. Chapter 4. State of the excavations on my return to Mosul. Discoveries at Kiyunyit. Tunnels in the mound. Bas-reliefs representing Assyrian conquests. A well. Siege of a city. Nature of sculptures at Kiyunyit. Arrangements for renewal of excavations. Description of mound. Giamil Pasha. Visit to Sheikh Adi. Yazidi ceremonies. Sheikh Jindi. Yazidi meeting. Dress of the women. Bavian. Doctrines of the Yazidi. Jereya. Return to Mosul. On the morning after our arrival in Mosul, I rode at sunrise to Kuyunyik. The reader may remember that, on my return to Europe in 1847, Mr. Ross had continued the researches in that mound and had uncovered several interesting bas-reliefs, which I have already described from his own account of his discoveries. That gentleman had, to my great regret, left Mosul. Since his departure, the excavations had been placed under the charge of Mr. Rassam, the English Vice-Consul, who was directed by the trustees of the British Museum to employ a small number of men, rather to retain possession of the spot and to prevent interference on the part of others, than to carry on extensive operations. Thomas Shishman, or the Fat, was still the overseer of the workmen, and accompanied me on my first visit to the ruins. But little change had taken place in the great mound since I had last seen it. It was yellow and bare, as it always is at this time of the year. Heaps of earth marked the site of former excavations, the chambers first discovered having been again completely buried with rubbish. Of the sculptured walls laid bare 2 years before, no traces now remained. The trenches dug under Mr. Ross's directions in the southern corner, opposite the town of Mosul, were still open. It was evident at a glance that the chambers he had entered did not, as he had been led to suppose, belong to a second palace. They formed part of the same great edifice once standing on this angle of the mound, and already partly explored. The style of the bas-reliefs and of the inscriptions marked them at once as of the same epoch as those previously discovered. The walls of 2 chambers had been laid bare. In one, the lower part of a long series of sculptures was still partly preserved, but the upper had been completely destroyed, the very alabaster itself having disappeared. The bas-reliefs recorded the subjection by the Assyrian king of a nation inhabiting the banks of a river. The captive women are distinguished by long embroidered robes fringed with tassels, and the castles have a peculiar wedge-shaped ornament on the walls. The towns probably stood in the midst of marshes, as they appear to be surrounded by canes or reeds, as well as by groves of palm trees. The Assyrians, having captured the strong places by escalade, carried the inhabitants into captivity, and drove away cattle, camels, and carts drawn by oxen. Some of the men bear large baskets of osier work, and the women vases or cauldrons. The king, standing in his chariot, attended by his warriors, and preceded by a eunuch, registering the number of prisoners and the amount of the spoil, receives the conquered chiefs. Not a vestige of inscription remains to record the name of the vanquished people, but we may conjecture, from the river and the palm trees, that they inhabited some district in southern Mesopotamia. In the southern wall of this chamber was a doorway formed by plain upright slabs of a close-grained magnesian limestone, almost as hard as flint. Between them were 2 small crouching lions in the usual alabaster. This entrance led into a further room, of which only a small part had been explored. The walls were panelled with unsculptured slabs of the same compact limestone. The sculptured remains hitherto discovered in the mound of Kuyunyik had been reached by digging down to them from the surface and then removing the rubbish. After the departure of Mr. Ross, the accumulation of earth above the ruins had become so considerable, frequently exceeding 30 feet, that the workmen, to avoid the labour of clearing it away, began to tunnel along the walls, sinking shafts at intervals to admit light and air. These long galleries, dimly lighted, lined with the remains of ancient art, broken urns projecting from the crumbling sides, and the wild Arab and hardy Nestorian wandering through their intricacies, or working in their dark recesses, were singularly picturesque. Thomas Shishman had removed the workmen from the southern corner of the mound, where the sculptures were much injured, and had opened tunnels in a part of the building previously explored, commencing where I had left off on my departure from Mosul. I descended into the vaulted passages by an inclined way, through which the workmen issued from beneath to throw away the rubbish dug out from the ruins. At the bottom, I found myself before a wall forming the southern side of the great hall, discovered, though only partly explored, during my former researches. The sculptures, faintly seen through the gloom, were still well enough preserved to give a complete history of the subject represented, although with the rest of the bas-reliefs of Kuyunyik, the fire had nearly turned them to lime, and had cracked them into 1,000 pieces. The faces of the slabs had been entirely covered with figures, varying from 3 inches to 1 foot in height, carefully finished and designed with great spirit. In this series of bas-reliefs, the history of an Assyrian conquest was more fully portrayed than in any other yet discovered, from the going out of the monarch to battle, to his triumphal return after a complete victory. The first part of the subject has already been described in my former work. The king, accompanied by his chariots and horsemen, and leaving his capital in the Assyrian plains, passed through a mountainous and wooded district. He does not appear to have been delayed by the siege of many towns or castles, but to have carried the war at once into the high country. His troops, cavalry and infantry, are represented in close combat with their enemies, pursuing them over hills and through valleys, beside streams and in the midst of vineyards. The Assyrian horsemen are armed with the spear and the bow, using both weapons whilst at full speed. Their opponents seem to be all archers. The vanquished turn to ask for quarter, or wounded fall under the feet of the advancing horses, raising their hands imploringly to ward off the impending death blow. The triumph follows, the king standing in his chariot beneath the royal parasol, followed by long lines of dismounted warriors leading richly caparisoned horses, and by foot soldiers variously armed and accoutred, is receiving the captives and spoil taken from the conquered people. First approach the victorious warriors, throwing the heads of the slain into heaps before the registering officers. They are followed by others leading, and urging onwards with staves, the prisoners, men chained together or bound singly in fetters, and women, some on foot, carrying their children on their shoulders, and leading them by the hand, others riding on mules. The procession is finished by asses, mules and flocks of sheep. As on the bas-reliefs uncovered by Mr. Ross, there is unfortunately no inscription by which the name of the conquered people can be determined. The mountains, valleys and streams, the vines and dwarf oaks, probably indicate a region north of Assyria, in Armenia, Media or Kurdistan, countries we know to have been invaded by the royal builder of the palace. The dress of the men consists of a short tunic, that of the women of a shirt falling to the ankles and cut low in front of the neck. In the side of the hall sculptured with these bas-reliefs was a wide portal, formed by a pair of gigantic human-headed bulls. They had suffered, like all those previously discovered from the fire, and the upper part, the wings and human head, had been completely destroyed. The lower half had, however, escaped, and the inscriptions were consequently nearly entire. Joined to the forepart of the bulls were 4 small figures, 2 on each side, and 1 above the other. They had long hair, falling in large and massive curls on their shoulders, wore short tunics descending to the knee, and held a pole topped by a kind of cone in one hand, raising the other as in act of adoration. At right angles with the slabs bearing these sculptures were colossal figures carrying the oft-repeated cone and basket. In this entrance, a well, cut through the large pavement slab between the bulls, was afterwards discovered. It contained broken pottery, not one vase having been taken out whole. Apparently human remains and some fragments of calcined sculptured alabaster, evidently detached from the bas-reliefs on the walls. It is doubtful whether this well was sunk after the Assyrian ruins had been buried, or whether it had been from the earliest times a place of deposit for the dead. A small doorway to the right of the portal, formed by the winged bulls, led into a further chamber, in which an entrance had been found into a third room, whose walls had been completely uncovered. Its dimensions were 26 feet by 23, and it had but this one outlet, flanked on either side by two colossal figures, whose lower extremities alone remain, the upper part of the slabs having been destroyed. One appeared to have been eagle-headed, with the body of a man, and the other a monster, with human head and the feet of a lion. The bas-reliefs round the chamber represented the siege of a castle standing on an artificial mound, surrounded at its base by houses. The besieged defended themselves on the walls and turrets with bows, spears and stones. The Assyrian army was composed of spearmen, slingers and bowmen, some of whom had already gained the housetops. Male and female captives had been taken and heads cut off. The victorious warriors, according to custom, and probably to claim a reward, bringing them to the registrars. In the background were wooded mountains. Vines and other trees formed a distinct band in the middle of the slabs, and a river ran at the foot of the mound. The dress of the male prisoners consisted either of a long robe falling to the ankles, or of a tunic reaching to the knees, over which was thrown an outer garment, apparently made of the skins of animals, and they wore greaves laced up in front. The women were clothed in a robe, descending to the feet, with an outer fringe garment thrown over the shoulders. A kind of hood or veil covered the back of the head, and fell over the neck. Above the castle was the fragment of an inscription in 2 lines, containing the name of the city, of which unfortunately the first character is wanting. It reads, "The city of Alamo, I attacked and captured. I carried away its spoil." No name, however, corresponding with it has yet been found in the royal annals, and we can only infer from the nature of the country represented that the place was in a mountainous district to the north of Assyria. This doorway to a third outlet opening to the west led into a narrow passage, one side of which had alone been excavated. On it was represented the siege of a walled city, divided into 2 parts by a river. One half of the place had been captured by the Assyrians, who had gained possession of the towers and battlements, but that on the opposite bank of the stream was still defended by slingers and bowmen. Against its walls had been thrown banks or mounds, built of stones, bricks and branches of trees. The battering rams, covered with skins or hides looped together, had been rolled up these inclined ways, and had already made a breach in the fortifications. Archers and spearmen were hurrying to the assault, whilst others were driving off the captives and carrying away the idols of the enemy. The dress of the male prisoners consisted of a plain undershirt, an upper garment falling below the knees, divided in the front and buttoned at the neck, and laced greaves. Their hair and beards were shorter and less elaborately curled than those of the Assyrians. The women were distinguished by high rounded turbans, ornamented with plaits or folds. A veil fell from the back of this headdress over the shoulders. No inscription remained to record the name of the vanquished nation. Such were the discoveries that had been made during my absence. There could be no doubt whatever that all the chambers hitherto excavated belonged to one great edifice, built by one and the same king. I have already shown how the bas-reliefs of Kuyunyik differed from those of the older places of Nimrud, but closely remembered those of Khorsabad in the general treatment in the costumes of the Assyrian warriors, as well as of the nations with whom they warred, and in the character of the ornaments, inscriptions and details, those newly uncovered were in all these respects like the bas-reliefs found before my departure, and upon which I had ventured to form an opinion as to the respective antiquity and origin of the various ruins hitherto explored in Assyria. At Qunyiq, there were probably few bas-reliefs, particularly those containing representations of castles and cities, that were not accompanied by a short epigraph or label, giving the name of the conquered king and country, and even the names of the principal prisoners, especially of royal personages. Unfortunately, these inscriptions, having been usually placed on the upper part of the slabs, which has very rarely escaped destruction, but few of them remain. These remarks should be borne in mind to enable the reader to understand the descriptions of the excavated chambers at Qunyiq, which will be given in the following pages in the order that they were discovered. I lost no time in making arrangements for continuing the excavations with as much activity as the funds granted to the trustees of the British Museum would permit. Thomas Shishman was placed over Qunyiq. Mansour Benan, the marble cutter, and Hana, the carpenter, again entered my service. Ali Rahal, a sheikh of the Jaburs, was appointed sheikh of the mound, and duly invested with the customary robe of honour on the occasion. The accumulation of soil above the ruins was so great that I determined to continue the tunnelling, removing only as much earth as was necessary to show the sculptured walls. But to facilitate the labour of the workmen, and to avoid the necessity of their leaving the tunnels to empty their baskets, I made a number of rude triangles and wooden pulleys by which the excavated rubbish could be raised by ropes through the shafts, sunk at intervals for this purpose, as well as to admit light and air. 1 or 2 passages then sufficed for the workmen to descend into the subterranean galleries. Many of the Nestorians formerly in my service as diggers, having also heard of my intended return, had left their mountains and had joined me a day or 2 after my arrival. There were Jaburs enough in the immediate neighbourhood of the town to make up 4 or 5 gangs of excavators, and I placed parties at once in the galleries already opened, in different parts of Qunyiq not previously explored, and at a high mound in the northwest walls, forming one side of the great enclosure opposite Mosul, a ruin which I had only partially examined during my previous visit. The shape of this great ruin is very irregular. Nearly square at the southwest corner, it narrows almost to a point at the northeast. The palace occupies the southern angle. At the opposite or northern extremity are the remains of the village of Qunyiq, from which the mound takes its name. From this spot, a steep road leads to the plain, forming the only access to the summit of the mound for loaded animals or carts. There are ravines on all sides of Qunyiq, except that facing the Tigris. If not entirely worn by the winter rains, they have undoubtedly been deepened and increased by them. They are strewed with fragments of pottery, bricks, and sometimes stone and burnt alabaster, while the falling earth frequently discloses in their sides vast masses of solid brick masonry, which fall in when undermined by the rains. Through these ravines are carried the steep and narrow pathways leading to the top of the mound. The Horsa winds round the eastern base of Qunyiq, and leaving it near the angle occupied by the ruins of the palace, runs in a direct line to the Tigris. Although a small and sluggish stream, it has worn for itself a deep bed, and is only fordable near the mound immediately below the southern corner, where the direct road from Mosul crosses it, and at the northern extremity where a flour mill is turned by its waters. After rain it becomes an impetuous torrent, overflowing its banks and carrying all before it. It then rises very suddenly and as suddenly subsides. The Tigris now flows about half a mile from the mound, but once undoubtedly washed its base. Between them is a rich alluvium deposited by the river during its gradual retreat. It is always under cultivation, and is divided into cornfields and melon and cucumber beds. In this plain stands the small modern village of Kyunyik, removed for convenience from its ancient site on the summit of the mound. In Mosul, I had to call upon the governor and renew my acquaintance with the principal inhabitants, whose goodwill was in some way necessary to the pleasant, if not successful, prosecution of my labours. Kamil Pasha had been lately named to the Pashalik. He was the 6th or 7th Pasha who had been appointed since I left, for it is one of the banes of Turkish administration that, as soon as an officer becomes acquainted with the country he is sent to govern and obtains any influence over its inhabitants, he is recalled to make room for a new ruler. Kamil had been ambassador at Berlin and had visited several European courts. His manners were eminently courteous and polished. His intelligence, and what is of far more importance in a Turkish governor, his integrity, were acknowledged. His principal defects were great inactivity and indolence, and an unfortunate irritability of temper, leading him to do foolish and mischievous things, of which he generally soon found cause to repent. Soon after my arrival, my old friends Sheikh Abdurrahman of the Abu Salman and Abdur Rabu, chief of the Jaburs, rode into the town to see me, where I had scarcely settled myself when Kawal Yusuf came in from Badri with a party of Yazidi Kawals to invite me, on the part of Hussein Bey and Sheikh Nasser, to the annual festival at Sheikh Adi. The invitation was too earnest to be refused. I was accompanied in this visit by my own party, with the addition of Mr. Rassan, the Vice Consul, and his dragoman. We rode the first day to Badri, and were met on the road by Hussein Bey and a large company of Yazidi horsemen. Sheikh Nasser had already gone to the tomb to make ready for the ceremonies. The young chief entertained us for the night, and on the following morning, an hour after sunrise, we left the village for Sheikh Adi. At some distance from the sacred valley, we were met by Sheikh Nasser, Bir Sino, the Kawals, the priests, and the chiefs. They conducted us to the same building in the sacred grove that I had occupied on my former visit. The Kawals assembled around us and welcomed our coming on their tambourines and flutes. And soon about us was formed one of those singularly beautiful and picturesque groups which I have attempted to describe in my previous account of the Yazidi festival. The Yazidis had assembled in less numbers this year than when I had last met them in the valley. Only a few of the best armed of the people of Sinjar had ventured to face the dangers of the road now occupied by the Bedouins. Abd Aga and his adherents were fully occupied in defending their villages against the Arab marauders, who, although repulsed after we quitted Samil, were still hanging about the district bent upon revenge. The Gujars and the tribes of Deribun were kept away by the same fears. The inhabitants of Khazan and Ridwan were harassed by the conscription. Even the people of Bashekar and Barzani had been so vexed by a recent visit from the Pasha that they had no heart for festivities. His Excellency, not fostering feelings of the most friendly nature towards Namik Pasha, the new commander-in-chief of Arabia, who was passing through Mosul on his way to the headquarters of the army at Baghdad, and unwilling to entertain him, was suddenly taken ill and retired for the benefit of his health to Bashekar. On the morning after his arrival, he complained that the asses, by their braying during the night, had allowed him no rest, and the asses were accordingly peremptorily banished from the village. The dawn of the next day was announced, to the great discomfort of His Excellency, who had no interest in the matter, by the cocks, and the irregular troops who formed his bodyguard were immediately incited to a general slaughter of the race. The third night, his sleep was disturbed by the crying of the children, who, with their mothers, were at once locked up for the rest of his sojourn in the cellars. On the fourth, he was awoke at daybreak by the chirping of sparrows, and every gun in the village was ordered to be brought out to wage a war of extermination against them. But on the fifth morning, His rest was sorely broken by the flies, and the enraged Bashar insisted upon their instant destruction. The Kiaya, who as chief of the village had the task of carrying out the governor's orders, now threw himself at his excellency's feet, exclaiming, "Your Highness has seen that all the animals here, praise be to God, obey our lord, the Sultan. The infidel flies alone are rebellious to his authority. I am a man of low degree and small power, and can do nothing against them. It now behooves a great vizier like your Highness to enforce the commands of our lord and master." The Pasha, who relished the joke, forgave the flies but left the village. I have already so fully described the general nature of the annual festival at Sheikh Adi and the appearance of the valley on that occasion, that I shall confine myself to an account of such ceremonies as I was now permitted to witness for the first time. About an hour after sunset, Gawal Yusuf summoned Hormuzd and myself, who were alone allowed to be present, to the inner yard or sanctuary of the temple. We were placed in a room from the windows of which we could see all that took place in the court. The Gawals, sheikhs, fakirs, and principal chiefs were already assembled. In the centre of the court was an iron lamp with 4 burners, a simple dish with 4 lips for the wicks, supported on a sharp iron rod driven into the ground. Near it stood a fakir, holding in one hand a lighted torch, and in the other a large vessel of oil, from which he from time to time replenished the lamp, loudly invoking Sheikh Adi. The Gawal stood against the wall on one side of the court and commenced a slow chant, some playing on the flute, others on the tambourine, and accompanying the measure with their voices. The sheikhs and chiefs now formed a procession, walking 2 by 2. At their head was Sheikh Jindi. He wore a tall, shaggy black cap, the hair of which hung far over the upper part of his face. A long robe, striped with horizontal stripes of black and dark red, fell to his feet. A countenance more severe, and yet more imposing than that of Sheikh Jindi, could not well be pictured by the most fanciful imagination. A beard, black as jet, waved low on his breast. His dark piercing eyes glittered through ragged eyebrows, like burning coals through the bars of a grate. The colour of his face was of the deepest brown, his teeth white as snow, and his features, though stern beyond measure, singularly noble and well formed. It was a byword with us that Sheikh Jindi had never been seen to smile. To look at him was to feel that a laugh could not be born in him. As he moved with a slow and solemn step, the flickering lamp deepening the shadows of his solemn and rugged countenance, it would have been impossible to conceive a being more eminently fitted to take the lead in ceremonies consecrated to the Evil One. He is the Beish Namaz, the leader of prayer to the Yazidi sect. Behind him were 2 venerable sheikhs. They were followed by Hussein Bey and Sheikh Nasser, and the other chiefs and sheikhs came after. Their long robes were all of the purest white, as they walked slowly round, sometimes stopping, then resuming their measured step. They chanted prayers in glory and honour of the deity. The Gawals accompanied the chant with their flutes, beating at intervals the tambourines, round the burning lamp, and within the circle formed by the procession, danced the fakirs in their black dresses, with solemn pace timed to the music, raising and swinging to and fro their arms after the fashion of Eastern dancers, and placing themselves in attitudes not less decorous than elegant. To hymns in praise of the deity succeeded others in honour of Malik Isa and Sheikh Adi. The chants passed into quicker strains, the tambourines were beaten more frequently. The fakirs became more active in their motions, and the women made the loud dalel, the ceremonies ending with that extraordinary scene of noise and excitement that I have attempted to describe in relating my first visit. When the prayers were ended, those who marched in procession kissed as they passed by the right side of the doorway leading into the temple, where a serpent is figured on the wall, but not, as I was assured, the image itself, which has no typical or other meaning, according to Sheikh Nasser and Gawal Yusuf. Hussein Bey, then placing himself on the step at this entrance, received the homage of the sheikhs and elders, each touching the hand of the young chief with his own, and raising it to his lips. All present afterwards gave one another the kiss of peace. The ceremonies having thus been brought to a close, Hussein Bey and Sheikh Nasser came to me and led me into the inner court. Carpets had been spread at the doorway of the temple for myself and the two chiefs. The sheikhs, gawals, and principal people of the sect seated themselves, or rather crouched, against the walls. By the light of a lamp, dimly breaking the gloom within the temple, I could see Sheikh Jindi unrobing. During the prayers, priests were stationed at the doorway, and none were allowed to enter except a few women and girls. The wives and daughters of sheikhs and gawals had free access to the building and appeared to join in the ceremonies. The vice consul and Khojdat Omar were now admitted and took their places with us at the upper end of the court. Gawal Yusuf was then called upon to give a full account of the result of his mission to Constantinople, which he did with the same detail and almost in the same words that he had used so frequently during our journey. After he had concluded, I endeavoured to urge upon them to avail themselves of the new privileges and opportunities for advancement and cultivation thus afforded them. It was finally agreed that letters of thanks, sealed by all the chiefs of the Yazidis, should be sent to the Grand Vizier, Rashid Basha, for the reception given to the Yazidi deputation, and to Sir Stratford Canning for his generous intercession in their behalf. Soon after sunrise on the following morning, the sheikhs and gawals offered up a short prayer in the court of the temple, but without any of the ceremonies of the previous evening. Some prayed in the sanctuary, frequently kissing the threshold and holy places within the building. When they had ended, they took the green cloth covering from the tomb of Sheikh Adi, and followed by the gawals, playing on their tambourines and flutes, walked with it round the outer court. The people flocked about them, and reverently carried the corner of the drapery to their lips, making afterwards a small offering of money. After the cover had again been thrown over the tomb, the chiefs and priests seated themselves round the inner court. The fakirs and sheikhs, especially devoted to the service of the sanctuary, who are called kochjeks, now issued from the kitchens of the temple bearing large platters of smoking harissa, which they placed on the ground. The company collected in hungry groups round the messes, and whilst they were eating, the kochjeks, standing by, called upon them continually in a loud voice to partake of the hospitality of Sheikh Adi. After the empty plates had been removed, a collection was made towards the support of the temple and tomb of the saint. These ceremonies occupied us until nearly midday. We then sat by the fountain in the valley, and the men and women danced before us, the boys climbing into the trees and hanging on the boughs to see the dancers. Sugar dates and raisins were afterwards scrambled amongst the children. The men soon took part in the amusement. A party of Kurds, bringing grapes from the mountains to sell at the festival, were maliciously pointed out as good objects for a joke. The hint was no sooner given than they, their donkeys, and their grapes were all rolled into one heap under a mountain of human beings. The Kurds, who were armed, resisted manfully, and ignorant of our intentions, might have revenged themselves on their assailants, but were soon restored to good humour when they found that they were to receive ample compensation for their losses and personal injuries. There was general laughing in the valley, and the Yazidis will long remember these days of simple merriment and happiness. In the afternoon, the wives and daughters of the chiefs and gawals called upon me. The families of the gawals, evidently descended from the same stock, are remarkable for the beauty both of the men and women, all of whom are strikingly like one another. Their complexion is perhaps too dark, but their features are regular and admirably formed. The dresses of the girls were elegant, and as rich as the material they could obtain would allow. Some wove flowers into their hair, others encircled their black turbans with a single wreath of myrtle, a simple and elegant ornament. They all wore many strings of coins, amber, coral, agate, and glass beads round their necks, and some had the black skull cap completely covered with gold and silver money, a kind of apron of grey or yellowish check, like a Scotch plaid, tied over one shoulder and falling in front over the silk dress, is a peculiar feature in the costume of the Yazidi girls and of some Christians from the same district. Unmarried women have the neck bare. The married conceal it with a white kerchief, which passes under the chin and is tied on the top of the head. The brightest colours are worn by the girls, but the matrons are usually clothed in plain white. The females of the Gawal families always wear black turbans and skull caps. Gawal Yusuf, to show how the Frank ladies he had seen at Constantinople were honoured by their husbands, made his young wife walk arm in arm with him before us, to the great amusement of the bystanders. At night the same religious ceremonies were repeated in the temple, and I was allowed to sleep in the room overlooking the inner court, from whence I had witnessed them on the previous evening. After all had retired to rest, the Yazidi mullah recited, in a low chanting tone, a religious history or discourse consisting of the adventures and teachings of a certain Mirza Muhammad. He stood before the burning lamp, and around him were at full length on the stone pavement, and covered by their white cloaks, the sleeping sheikhs and gawals. The scene was singularly picturesque and impressive. Next morning I visited with Mr. Assam and Mr. Cooper the rock sculptures of Bavian, which are not more than 6 miles from the valley of Sheikh Adi in the same range of hills. But I will defer a description of these remarkable monuments until I come to relate my second journey to the spot. Gawal Yusuf had promised, on the occasion of the festival, to show me the sacred book of the Yazidis. He accordingly brought a volume to me one morning, accompanied by the secretary of Sheikh Nasser, the only Yazidi, as far as I am aware, who could read it. It consisted of a few tattered leaves, of no ancient date, containing a poetical rhapsody on the merits and attributes of Sheikh Adi, who is identified with the deity himself as the origin and creator of all things, though evidently distinguished from the eternal essence by being represented as seeking the truth, and as reaching through it the highest place, which he declares to be attainable by all those who, like him, shall find the truth. This was the only written work that I was able to obtain from the Yazidis. Their Gawals repeated several prayers and hymns to me, which were purely laudatory of the deity and unobjectionable in substance. Numerous occupations during the remainder of my residence in Assyria prevented me from prosecuting my inquiries much further on this subject. Gawal Yusuf informed me that before the great massacre of the sect by the Bey of Rawanduz, they possessed many books which were lost during the general panic or destroyed by the Kurds. He admitted that this was only a fragmentary composition and by no means the book, which contained the theology and religious laws of the Yazidi. He even hinted that the great work did still exist, and I am by no means certain that there is not a copy at Basheikhar or Barzani. The account given by the Gawal seems to be confirmed by the allusion made in the poem to the Book of Glad Tidings and the Book that Comforteth the Oppressed, which could scarcely have been inserted for any particular purpose, such as to deceive their Mohammedan neighbours. I will here add a few notes concerning the Yazidis and their faith to those contained in my former work. They were chiefly obtained from Kawal Yusuf. They believe that Christ will come to govern the world, but that after him, Sheikh Mehdi will appear, to whom will be given special jurisdiction over those speaking the Kurdish language, including the Yazidis. This is evidently a modern interpolation, derived from Muslim sources, perhaps invented to conciliate the Mohammedans. All who go to heaven must first pass an expiatory period in hell, but no one will be punished eternally. Mohammedans they exclude from all future life, but not Christians. This may have been said to avoid giving offence. The Yazidis will not receive converts to their faith. Circumcision is optional. When a child is born near enough to the tomb of Sheikh Adi to be taken there without great inconvenience or danger, he should be baptized as early as possible after birth. The Kawals in their periodical visitations carry a bottle or skin filled with the holy water to baptize those children who cannot be brought to the shrine. There are 40 days fast in the spring of the year, but they are observed by few. One person in a family may fast for the rest. They should abstain during that period as completely as the Chaldeans from animal food. Sheikh Nasser fasts rigidly for 1 month in the year, eating only once in 24 hours and immediately after sunset. Only one wife is strictly lawful, although the chief takes more, but concubines are not forbidden. The wife may be turned away for great misconduct, and the husband, with the consent of the sheikhs, may marry again. But the discarded wife never can. Even such divorces ought only to be given in cases of adultery, for formerly, when the Yazidis administered their own temporal laws, the wife was punished with death, and the husband, of course, was then released. The religious as well as the political head of all Yazidis, wherever they may reside, is Hussein Bey, who is called the Khalifa, and he holds his position by inheritance. As he is young and inexperienced, he deputes his religious duties to Sheikh Nasser. Sheikh Nasser is only the chief of the sheikhs of the district of Sheikhan. The Kawals are all of one family and are under the orders of Hussein Bey, who sends them periodically to collect the voluntary contributions of the various tribes. The amount received by them is divided into 2 equal parts, one of which goes to the support of the tomb of Sheikh Adi, and half of the other to Hussein Bey, the remainder being equally shared by the Kawals. Neither the priests nor Hussein Bey ever shave their beards. They ought not to marry out of their own order, and though the men do not observe this rule very strictly, the women are never given in marriage to one out of the rank of the priesthood. Hussein Bey ought to take his wife from the family of Jul Beg. After death, the body of a Yazidi, like that of a Mohammedan, is washed in running water, and then buried with the face turned towards the North Star. I have stated that it is unlawful amongst the Yazidis to know how to read or write. This, I am assured, is not the case, and their ignorance arises from want of means and proper teachers. Formerly, a Chaldean deacon used to instruct the children. Kawal Yusuf mentioned accidentally that, amongst the Yazidis, the ancient name for God was Azed, and from it he derived the name of his sect. Their Qibla, he declared, was the polar star and not the east. On my way to Mosul from Sheikh Adi, I visited the ruins of Jereya, where excavations had been again carried on by one of my agents. No ancient buildings were discovered. The principal mound is lofty and conical in shape, and the base is surrounded by smaller mounds, and irregularities in the soil which denote the remains of houses. I had not leisure during my residence in Assyria to examine the spot as fully as it may deserve. End of chapter 4.
Chapter 5, Part 1 of Discoveries Among the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jane Bennett. Discoveries among the ruins of Nineveh and Babylon by Austen Layard. Chapter 5, Part 1. We were again in Mosul by the 12th of October. The Jabours, my old workmen, had now brought their families to the town. I directed them to cross the river and to pitch their tents over the excavations at Kuyunjik, as they had formerly done around the trenches at Nimrud. The Bedouins, unchecked in their forays by the Turkish authorities, had become so bold that they ventured to the very walls of Mosul, and I felt it necessary to have a strong party on the ruins for self-defence. The Jabours were, however, on good terms with the Bedouins, and had lately encamped amongst them. About 100 workmen, divided into 12 or 14 parties, were employed at Kuyunjik. The Arabs, as before, removed the earth and rubbish, while the more difficult labour with the pick was left entirely to the Nestorian mountaineers. My old friend Yaqub, the Rais of Asthita, was named superintendent of the Tiyari workmen, for whom I built mud huts near the foot of the mound. The work having thus begun at Kuyunjik, I rode with Hormuzd to Nimrud for the first time on the 18th of October. It seemed but yesterday that we had followed the same track. We stopped at each village and found, in each, old acquaintances ready to welcome us. From the crest of the hill halfway, the first view of Nimrud opened upon us. The old mound on which I had gazed so often from this spot, and with which so many happy recollections were bound up, rising boldly above the Jif, the river winding through the plain, the distant wreaths of smoke marking the villages of Nineveh and Nimrud. I dismounted at my old house, which was still standing, though somewhat in ruins, for it had been the habitation of the Kiaya during my absence, and to avoid the vermin swarming in the rooms, my tent was pitched in the courtyard, and I dwelt entirely in it. The village had still, comparatively speaking, a flourishing appearance, and had not diminished in size since my last visit. The Tanzimat, or reformed system of local administration, had been introduced into the Pashalik of Mosul, and although many of its regulations were evaded and arbitrary acts were still occasionally committed, yet on the whole a marked improvement had taken place in the dealings of the authorities with the subjects of the Sultan. The great cause of complaint was the want of security. The troops under the command of the Pasha were not sufficient in number to keep the Bedouins in check, and there was scarcely a village in the low country which had not suffered more or less from their depredations. Nimrud was particularly exposed to their incursions, and the inhabitants lived in continual agitation and alarm. By sunrise I was amongst the ruins. The mound had undergone no change. There it rose from the plain, the same sunburnt yellow heap that it had stood for 20 centuries. The earth and rubbish, which had been heaped over the excavated chambers and sculptured slabs, had settled and had left uncovered in sinking the upper part of several bas-reliefs. A few colossal heads of winged figures rose calmly above the level of the soil, and with 2 pairs of winged bulls, which had not been reburied on account of their mutilated condition, was all that remained above ground of the northwest palace, that great storehouse of Assyrian history and art. Collecting together my old excavators from the Shemuti and Jahesh, the Arab tribes who inhabit Nimrud and Nineveh, and from the tents of a few Jabours who still lingered round the village to glean a scanty subsistence after the harvest, I placed workmen in different parts of the mound. The northwest palace had not been fully explored. Most of the chambers, which didn't contain sculptured slabs, but were simply built of sun-dried bricks, had been left unopened. I consequently directed a party of workmen to resume the excavations where they had been formerly abandoned. New trenches were also opened in the ruins of the centre palace, where as yet no sculptures had been discovered in their original position against the walls. The high conical mound forming the northwest corner of Nimrud, the pyramid as it has usually been called, had always been an object of peculiar interest, which want of means had hitherto prevented me fully examining. With the exception of a shaft about 40 feet deep, sunk nearly in the centre and passing through a solid mass of sun-dried bricks, no other opening had been made into this singular ruin. I now ordered a tunnel to be carried into its base on the western face, and on a level with the conglomerate rock upon which it rested. As I ascended the mound next morning, I perceived a group of travellers on its summit, their horses picketed in the stubble. Ere I could learn what strangers had thus wandered to this remote region, my hand was seized by the faithful Bayraktar. Beneath, in an excavated chamber, wrapped in his travelling cloak, was Rawlinson deep in sleep, wearied by a long and harassing night's ride. For the first time we met in the Assyrian ruins, and besides the greetings of old friendship, there was much to be seen together and much to be talked over. The fatigues of the journey had, however, brought on fever, and we were soon compelled, after visiting the principal excavations, to take refuge from the heat of the sun in the mud huts of the village. The attack increasing in the evening, it was deemed prudent to ride into Mosul at once, and we mounted our horses in the middle of the night. During 2 days, Colonel Rawlinson was too ill to visit the excavations at Kuyanjik. On the 3rd, we rode together to the mound. After a hasty survey of the ruins, we parted, and he continued his journey to Constantinople and to England, to reap the laurels of a well-earned fame. My readers would be wearied were I to relate, day by day, the progress of the excavations, and to record, as they were gradually made, the discoveries in the various ruins. It will give a more complete idea of the results of the researchers to describe the sculptured walls of a whole chamber when entirely explored, instead of noting, one by one, as dug out, bas-reliefs which form but part of the same subject. I will therefore merely mention that during the months of October and November, my time was spent between Kuyanjik and Nimrud, and that the excavations were carried on at both places without interruption. Mr. Cooper was occupied in drawing the bas-reliefs discovered at Kuyanjik, living in Mosul and riding over daily to the ruins. To Mr. Hormuz Rassam, who usually accompanied me in my journeys, were confided as before the general superintendence of the operations, the payment of the workmen, the settlement of disputes, etc. His services were invaluable and of the greatest consequence to the success of my labours. The Arab workmen were divided into several classes, and their wages varied according to their respective occupations, as well as according to the time of year. They were generally paid weekly by Hormuzd. The diggers, who were exposed to very severe labour and even to considerable risk, received from 2 piastres and a half to 3 piastres, from 5p to 6p a day. Those who filled the baskets from 2 piastres to 2.5, and the general workmen from 1.5 to 2 piastres. The earth, when removed, was sifted by boys, who earned about 1 piastre for their day's labour. These wages may appear low, but they are amply sufficient for the support of a family in a country where the camel load of wheat nearly £480, is sold for about 4 shillings, and where no other protection from the inclemencies of the weather is needed than a linen shirt and the black folds of an Arab tent. The Kuyanjik workmen were usually paid in the subterraneous galleries, some convenient space where several passages met being chosen for the purpose, those of Nimrud generally in the village. A scene of wild confusion ensued on these occasions, from which an inexperienced observer might argue a sad want of order and method. This was, however, but the way of doing business usual in the country. When there was a difference of opinion, he who cried the loudest gained the day, and after a desperate struggle of voices, matters relapsed into their usual state, everyone being perfectly satisfied. Screaming and gesticulation with Easterns by no means signify ill will, or even serious disagreement. Without them, except of course amongst the Turks who are staid and dignified to a proverb, the most ordinary transactions cannot be carried on, and they are frequently rather symptoms of friendship than of hostility. By the end of November, several entire chambers had been excavated at Kuyanjik, and many bas-reliefs of great interest had been discovered. The 4 sides of the hall, part of which has already been described, had now been explored. In the centre of each side was a grand entrance, guarded by colossal human-headed bulls. This magnificent hall was no less than 124 feet in length by 90 feet in breadth, the longest sides being those to the north and south. It appears to have formed a centre, around which the principal chambers in this part of the palace were grouped. Its walls had been completely covered with the most elaborate and highly finished sculptures. Unfortunately, all the bas-reliefs, as well as the gigantic monsters at the entrance, had suffered more or less from the fire which had destroyed the edifice, but enough of them still remained to show the subject, and even to enable me in many places to restore it entirely. The narrow passage leading from the great hall at the southwest corner had been completely explored. Its sculptures have already been described. It opened into a chamber 24 feet by 19, from which branched 2 other passages. The one to the west was entered by a wide doorway, in which stood 2 plain spherical stones about 3 feet high, having the appearance of the bases of columns, although no traces of any such architectural ornament could be found. This was the entrance into a broad and spacious gallery, about 218 feet long and 25 wide. A tunnel at its western end cut through the solid wall, as there was no doorway on this side of the gallery, led into the chambers excavated by Mr. Ross, thus connecting them with the rest of the building. I have already described the bas-reliefs representing the conquest of a mountainous country on the southern side of the Great Hall. The same subject was continued on the western wall, without much variety in the details. But on the northern, the sculptures differed from any others yet discovered, and from their interest and novelty merit a particular notice. But before giving a description of them, I must return to the long gallery to the west of the Great Hall, as the sculptures still preserved in it form part of and complete this important series. The slabs on one side of this gallery had been entirely destroyed, except at the eastern end, and from the few which still remained, every trace of sculpture had been carefully removed by some sharp instrument. Along the opposite wall, that to the right on leaving the Great Hall, only 8 bas-reliefs still stood in their original position, and even of these only the lower part was preserved. Detached fragments of others were found in the rubbish. and from them I ascertained that the whole gallery had been occupied by one continuous series, representing the different processes adopted by the Assyrians in moving and placing various objects used in their buildings, and especially the human-headed bulls, from the first transport of the huge stone in the rough from the quarry to the raising of these gigantic sculptures in the gateways of the palace temples. On these fragments were seen the king in his chariot, superintending the operations, and workmen carrying cables or dragging carts loaded with coils of rope, and various implements for moving the colossi. I will commence then by a description of the sculptures still standing in their original position in the gallery. A huge block of stone, probably of the alabaster used in the Assyrian edifices, somewhat elongated in form so as to resemble an obelisk in the rough, is lying on a low, flat-bottomed boat floating on a river. It has probably been towed down the Tigris from some quarry, and is to be landed near the site of the intended palace, to be carved by the sculptor into the form of a colossal bull. It exceeds the boat considerably in length, projecting beyond both the head and stern, and is held by upright beams fastened to the sides of the vessel and kept firm in their places by wooden wedges. 2 cables are passed through holes cut in the stone itself, and a third is tied to a strong pin projecting from the head of the boat. Each cable is held by a large body of men, who pull by means of small ropes fastened to it and passed around their shoulders. Some of these trackers walk in the water, others on dry land. The number altogether represented must have been nearly 300, about 100 to each cable, and they appear to be divided into distinct bands, each distinguished by a peculiar costume. Some wear a kind of embroidered turban, through which their long hair is gathered behind. The heads of others are encircled by a fringed shawl whose ends hang over the ears and neck, leaving the hair to fall in long curls upon the shoulders. Many are represented naked, but the greater number are dressed in short checkered tunics with a long fringe attached to the girdle. They are urged on by taskmasters armed with swords and staves. The boat is also pushed by men wading through the stream. An overseer, who regulates the whole proceedings, is seated astride on the forepart of the stone. His hands are stretched out in the act of giving commands. The huge stone having been landed and carved by the Assyrian sculptor into the form of a colossal human-headed bull, is to be moved from the bank of the river to the site it is meant to occupy permanently, in the palace temple. This process is represented on the walls of the Great Hall. From these bas-reliefs, as well as from discoveries to be hereafter mentioned, it is therefore evident that the Assyrians sculptured their gigantic figures before, and not after, the slabs had been raised in the edifice, although all the details and the finishing touches weren't put in, as it will be seen, until they had been finally placed. I am still, however, of opinion that the smaller bas-reliefs were entirely executed after the slabs had been attached to the walls. In the first bas-relief I shall describe, the colossal bull rests horizontally on a sledge, similar in form to the boat containing the rough block from the quarry. But either in the carving, the stone has been greatly reduced in size, or the sledge is much larger than the boat as it considerably exceeds the sculpture in length. The bull faces the spectator, and the human head rests on the forepart of the sledge, which is curved upward and strengthened by a thick beam, apparently running completely through from side to side. The upper part, or deck, is otherwise nearly horizontal, the under, or keel, being slightly curved throughout. props, probably of wood, are placed under different parts of the sculpture to secure an equal pressure. The sledge was dragged by cables and impelled by levers. The cables are 4 in number, 2 fastened to strong projecting pins in front and 2 to similar pins behind. They are pulled by small ropes passing over the shoulders of the men, as in the bas-reliefs already described. On the bull itself are 4 persons, probably the superintending officers. The first is kneeling and appears to be clapping his hands, probably beating time to regulate the motions of the workmen, who, unless they applied their strength at one and the same movement, would be unable to move so large a weight. Behind him stands a second officer with outstretched arm, evidently giving the word of command. The next holds to his mouth either a speaking trumpet or an instrument of music. If the former, it proves that the Assyrians were acquainted with a means of conveying sound presumed to be of modern invention. In form it undoubtedly resembles the modern speaking trumpet, and in no bas-relief hitherto discovered does a similar object occur as an instrument of music. The fourth officer, also standing, carries a mace, and is probably stationed behind to give directions to those who work the levers. The sledge bearing the sculpture is followed by men with coils of rope and various implements, and drawing carts laden with cables and beams. A subject similar to that just described is represented in another series of bas-reliefs, with even fuller details. The bull is placed in the same manner on the sledge, which is also moved by cables and levers. It's accompanied by workmen with saws, hatchets, pickaxes, shovels, ropes and props, and by carts carrying cables and beams. Upon it are 3 officers directing the operations, one holding the trumpet in his hands, and in front walk 4 other overseers. Above the sledge and the workmen are rows of trees and a river on which are circular boats, resembling in shape the kufas now used on the lower part of the Tigris, and probably like them, built of reeds and osier twigs, covered with square pieces of hide. They are heavily laden with beams and implements required for moving the bulls. On a fallen slab, forming part of the same general series, is the king standing in a richly decorated chariot, the pole of which, curved upwards at the end and ornamented with the head of a horse, is raised by eunuchs. From the peculiar form of this chariot and the absence of a yoke, it would seem to have been intended purposely for such occasions as that represented in the bas-relief, and to have been a kind of movable throne drawn by men and not by horses. Behind the monarch, who holds a kind of flower or ornament in the shape of the fruit of the pine, in one hand stand 2 eunuchs, one raising a parasol to shade him from the sun, the other cooling him with a fan. He appears to have been superintending the transport of one of the colossal sculptures, and his chariot is preceded and followed by his bodyguard, armed with maces. The next series of bas-reliefs represent the building of the artificial platforms on which the palaces were erected, and the Assyrians moving to their summit the colossal bulls. The king is again seen in his chariot drawn by eunuchs, whilst an attendant raises the royal parasol above his head. He overlooks the operations from that part of the mound to which the sledge is being dragged, and before him stands his bodyguard, a long line of alternate spearmen and archers, resting their arms and shields upon the ground. At the bottom of the slab is represented a river, on the banks of which are seen men raising water by a simple machine, still generally used for irrigation in the east as well as in southern Europe, and called in Egypt a shadoof. It consists of a long pole balanced on a shaft of masonry and turning on a pivot. To one end is attached a stone and to the other a bucket. which after being lowered into the water and filled, is easily raised by the help of the opposite weight. Its contents are then emptied into a conduit communicating with the various watercourses running through the fields. In the neighbourhood of Mosul, this mode of irrigation is now rarely used, the larger skins raised by oxen affording a better supply and giving, it is considered, less trouble to the cultivator. It would appear that the men employed in building the artificial mound were captives and malefactors, for many of them are in chains, some singly, others bound together by an iron rod attached to rings in their girdles. The fetters, like those of modern criminals, confine the legs and are supported by a bar fastened to the waist, or consist of simple shackles round the ankles. They wear a short tunic and a conical cap, somewhat resembling the Phrygian bonnet, with the curved crest turned backwards, a costume very similar to that of the tribute bearers on the Nimrud obelisk. Each band of workmen is followed and urged on by taskmasters, armed with staves. The mound or artificial platform, having been thus built, not always, as it has been seen, with regular layers of sun-dried bricks, but frequently in parts with mere heaped-up earth and rubbish. The next step was to drag to its summit the colossal figures prepared for the palace. As some of the largest of these sculptures were full 20 feet square, and must have weighed between 40 and 50 tons, this was no easy task with such means as the Assyrians possessed. The only aid to mere manual strength was derived from the rollers and levers. Behind the monarch, on an adjoining slab, are carts bearing the cables, wedges and implements required in moving the sculpture. A long beam or lever is slung by ropes from the shoulders of 3 men, and one of the great wedges is carried in the same way. In the upper compartment of this slab is a stream issuing from the foot of hills wooded with vines, fig trees and pomegranates. Beneath stands a town or village, the houses of which have domes and high conical roofs, probably built of mud as in parts of northern Syria. The domes have the appearance of dish covers with a handle, the upper part being topped by a small circular projection, perhaps intended as an aperture to admit light and air. This interesting series is completed by a bas-relief, showing, it would seem, the final placing of the colossal bull. The figure no longer lies horizontally on the sledge, but is raised by men with ropes and forked wooden props. It's kept in its erect position by beams, held together by crossbars and wedges, and is further supported by blocks of stone, or wood, piled up under the body. Cables, ropes, rollers and levers are also employed on this occasion to move the gigantic sculpture. The captives are distinguished by the peculiar turbans before described. We have thus represented, with remarkable fidelity and spirit, the several processes employed to place these colossi where they still stand, from the transport down the river of the rough block to the final removal of the sculptured figure to the palace. From these bas-reliefs we find that the Assyrians were well acquainted with the lever and the roller, and that they ingeniously made use of the former by carrying with them wedges of different dimensions and probably of wood to vary the height of the fulcrum. When moving the winged bulls and lions, now in the British Museum, from the ruins to the banks of the Tigris, I used almost the same means. The Assyrians, like the Egyptians, had made considerable progress in rope twisting, an art now only known in its rudest state in the same part of the East. The cables appear to be of great length and thickness, and ropes of various dimensions are represented in the sculptures. On comparing representations of similar works among the Egyptians, it will be found that they succeeded in removing masses of stone far exceeding in weight any sculpture which has yet been discovered in Assyria. Yet it is a singular fact that whilst the quarries of Egypt bear witness of themselves to the stupendous nature of the works of the ancient inhabitants of the country, and still show on their sides engraved records of those who made them, no traces whatever, notwithstanding the most careful research, have yet been found to indicate from whence the builders of the Assyrian palaces obtained their large slabs of alabaster. That they were in the immediate neighbourhood of Nineveh, there's scarcely any reason to doubt, as strata of this material, easily accessible, abound, not only in the hills but in the plains. This very abundance may have rendered any particular quarry unnecessary, and blocks were probably taken as required from convenient spots, which have since been covered by the soil. There can be no doubt, as will hereafter be shown, that the king represented as superintending the building of the mounds and the placing of the colossal bulls is Sennacherib himself, and that the sculptures celebrate the building at Nineveh of the great palace and its adjacent temples, described in the inscriptions as the work of this monarch. Unfortunately, only fragments of the epigraphs have been preserved. From them it would appear that the transport of more than one object was represented on the walls. Besides bulls and sphinxes in stone, are mentioned figures in some kind of wood, perhaps of olive, like the 2 cherubims of olive tree, each 10 cubits high in the Temple of Solomon. Over the king superintending the removal of one of these colossi is the following short inscription, thus translated by Dr. Hinks: Sennacherib, king of Assyria, the great figures of bulls, which in the land of Bilad were made for his royal palace at Nineveh, he transported thither. The land of Bilad, mentioned in these inscriptions, appears to have been a district in the immediate vicinity of Nineveh, and probably on the Tigris, as these great masses of stone would have been quarried near the river for the greater convenience of moving them to the palace. The district of Bilad may indeed have been that in which the city itself stood. Over the representation of the building of the mound there were 2 epigraphs, both precisely similar, but both unfortunately much mutilated. As far as they can be restored, they have thus been interpreted by Dr. Hinks. Sennacherib, king of Assyria. Hewn stones, which, as the gods willed, were found in the land of Bilad, for the walls, or foundations, the word reads shibri, of my palace, I caused the inhabitants of foreign countries, and the people of the forests, Kershani, the great bulls for the gates of my palace to drag or bring. If this inscription be rightly rendered, we have direct evidence that captives from foreign countries were employed in the great public works undertaken by the Assyrian kings, as we were led to infer from the variety of costume represented in the bas-reliefs, and from the fetters on the legs of some of the workmen. The Jews themselves, after their captivity, may have been thus condemned to labour, as their forefathers had been in Egypt, in erecting the monuments of their conquerors, and we may perhaps recognise them amongst the builders portrayed in the sculptures. From the long gallery we have unfortunately only 3 fragments of inscriptions, without the sculptured representations of the events recorded. The most perfect is interesting on more than one account. According to Dr. Hinks, it's to be translated, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, some object, the nature not ascertained, of wood which from the Tigris I caused to be brought up, or through, the carry, or kasri, on sledges, or boats, I caused to be carried, or to mount. The name of the river in this inscription very nearly resembles that of the small stream which sweeps round the foot of the great mound of Kuyangjik. In the fragment of another epigraph we have mention of some objects also of wood, brought from Mount Lebanon and taken up to the top of the mound from the Tigris. These may have been beams of cedar, which it will be hereafter seen were extensively used in the Assyrian palaces. It is highly interesting thus to find the inhabitants of Nineveh fetching their rare and precious woods from the same spots that King Solomon had brought the choicest woodwork of the temple of the Lord and of his own palaces. On a third fragment, similar objects are described as coming from or up the same Kari or Khazri. I have mentioned that the long gallery containing the bas-relief representing the moving of the great stone led out of a chamber whose walls had been completely uncovered. The sculptures upon them were partly preserved and recorded the conquest of a city standing on a broad river in the midst of mountains and forests. The last bas-relief of the series represented the king seated within a fortified camp on a throne of elaborate workmanship, and having beneath his feet a footstool of equally elegant form. He was receiving the captives who wore long robes falling to their ankles. Unfortunately, no inscription remained by which we might identify the conquered nation. It will be remembered that excavations had been resumed in a lofty mound in the northwest line of walls forming the enclosure round Kuyanjik. It was apparently the remains of a gate leading into this quarter of the city and part of a building, with fragments of 2 colossal winged figures had already been discovered in it. By the end of November, the whole had been explored and the results were of considerable interest. As the mound rises nearly 50 feet over the plain, we were obliged to tunnel along the walls of the building within it, through a compact mass of rubbish consisting almost entirely of loose bricks. Following the rows of low limestone slabs from the south side of the mound, and passing through 2 halls or chambers, we came at length to the opposite entrance. This gateway, facing the open country, was formed by a pair of majestic human-headed bulls, 14 feet in length, still entire, though cracked and injured by fire. They were similar in form to those of Khorsabad and Kuyanjik, wearing the lofty headdress, richly ornamented with rosettes and edged with a fringe of feathers peculiar to that period. Their faces were in full, and the relief was high and bold. More knowledge of art was shown in the outline of the limbs and in the delineation of the muscles than in any sculpture I have seen of this period. The naked leg and foot were designed with a spirit and truthfulness worthy of a Greek artist. It is, however, remarkable that the 4 figures were unfinished, none of the details having been put in, and parts being but roughly outlined. The sculptures to the left, on entering from the open country, were in a far more unfinished state than those on the opposite side. The hair and beard were but roughly marked out, square bosses being left for carving the elaborate curls. The horned cap of the human-headed bull was as yet unornamented, and the wings merely outlined. The limbs and features were hard and angular, still requiring to be rounded off, and to have expression given to them by the finishing touch of the artist. The other 2 figures were more perfect. No inscription had yet been carved on either sculpture. The entrance formed by these colossal bulls was 14 feet and a quarter wide. It was paved with large slabs of limestone, still bearing the marks of chariot wheels. The sculptures were buried in a mass of brick and earth, mingled with charcoal and charred wood, for the gates of the land had been set wide open unto the enemy, and the fire had devoured the bars. They were lighted from above by a deep shaft sunk from the top of the mound. It would be difficult to describe the effect produced, or the reflections suggested by these solemn and majestic figures, dimly visible amidst the gloom, when after winding through the dark underground passages, you suddenly came into their presence. Between them Sennacherib and his hosts had gone forth in all their might and glory to the conquest of distant lands, and had returned rich with spoil and captives, amongst whom may have been the handmaidens and wealth of Israel. Through them too the Assyrian monarch had entered his capital in shame, after his last and fatal defeat. Then the lofty walls, now but long lines of low wave-like mounds, had stretched far to the right and to the left, a basement of stone supporting a curtain of solid brick masonry, crowned with battlements and studded with frowning towers. Behind the colossal figures and between the outer and inner face of the gateway were two chambers nearly 70 feet in length by 23 in breadth. Of that part of the entrance which was within the walls, only the fragments of winged figures discovered during my previous researches now remained. The whole entrance thus consisted of two distinct chambers and three gateways, two formed by human-headed bulls, and a third between them simply panelled with low limestone slabs like the chambers. Its original height, including the tower, must have been full 100 feet. Most of the baked bricks found amongst the rubbish bore the name of Sennacherib, the builder of the palace of Kuyanjik. A similar gateway, but without any remains of sculptured figures, and panelled with plain alabaster slabs, was subsequently discovered in the inner line of walls forming the eastern side of the quadrangle, where the road to Barshika and Barzani leaves the ruins. At Nimrud, discoveries of very considerable importance were made in the high conical mound at the northwest corner. Desirous of fully exploring that remarkable ruin, I had employed nearly all the workmen in opening a tunnel into its western base. After penetrating for no less than 84 feet through a compact mass of rubbish, composed of loose gravel, earth, burnt bricks and fragments of stone, the excavators came to a wall of solid stone masonry. I have already observed that the edifice covered by this high mound was originally built upon the natural rock, a bank of hard conglomerate rising about 15 feet above the plain and washed in days of yore by the waters of the Tigris. Our tunnel was carried for 34 feet on a level with this rock, which appears to have been covered by a kind of flooring of sun-dried bricks, probably once forming a platform in front of the building. It was buried to the distance of 30 feet from the wall by baked bricks, broken and entire, and by fragments of stone, remains of the superstructure once resting upon the basement of still existing stone masonry. This mass of rubbish was about 30 feet high, and in it were found bones, apparently human, and a yellow earthen jar, rudely coloured with simple black designs. The rest of this part of the mound consisted of earth, through which ran two thin lines of extraneous deposit, one of pebbles, the other of fragments of brick and pottery. I am totally at a loss to account for their formation. I ordered tunnels to be carried along the basement wall in both directions, hoping to reach some doorway or entrance, but it was found to consist of solid masonry, extending nearly the whole length of the mound. Its height was exactly 20 feet, which, singularly enough, coincides with that assigned by Xenophon to the stone basement of the wall of the city, Larissa. The stones in this structure were carefully fitted together, though not united with mortar, unless the earth which filled the crevices was the remains of mud, used as it still is in the country as a cement. They were bevelled with a slanting bevel, and in the face of the wall were 8 recesses or false windows, 4 on each side of a square projecting block between gradines. The basement, of which this wall proved to be only one face, was not excavated on the northern and eastern side until a later period, but I'll describe all the discoveries connected with this singular building at once. The northern side was of the same height as, and resembled in its masonry, the western. It had a semicircular hollow projection in the centre, 16 feet in diameter, on the east side of which were 2 recesses, and on the west 4, so that the 2 ends of the wall were not uniform. That part of the basement against which the great artificial mound or platform abutted, and which was consequently concealed by it, that is, the eastern and southern side, was of simple stone masonry without recesses or ornament. The upper part of the edifice, resting on the stone substructure, consisted of compact masonry of burnt bricks, which were mostly inscribed with the name of the founder of the centre palace, the obelisk king, the inscription being in many instances turned outward. It was thus evident that the high conical mound forming the northwest corner of the ruins of Nimrud was the remains of a square tower, and not of a pyramid, as had previously been conjectured. The lower part, built of solid stone masonry, had withstood the wreck of ages, but the upper walls of burnt brick and the inner mass of sun-dried brick which they encased, falling outwards, and having been subsequently covered with earth and vegetation, the ruin had taken the pyramidal form that loose materials falling in this manner would naturally assume. End of Chapter 5, Part 1.